You may have heard of the mighty Zeus, god of thunder and ruler of Mount Olympus. His name dominates mythological tales, often accompanied by flashes of lightning and tales of conquest. But less attention is paid to a quieter, though far stranger. This is the story of Dionysus, a god who was neither fully Olympian nor fully mortal, and whose very birth defied the rules of nature. Dionysus wasn't always the god of wine, pleasure, and chaos. He was once just a strange, unsettling infant, born under confusing, tragic, and miraculous circumstances. And unlike the other gods of Mount Olympus, his early days were filled not with glory but with banishment, secrecy, and wandering. Let's begin not with Dionysus, but with his mother Semele. Semele was a mortal princess of Thebes, daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia. She was a figure of quiet beauty and, perhaps more importantly to our tale, devout piety. Her family lineage was royal, but even royalty could not prepare her for what would happen next. Zeus, always entangled in romantic chaos, fell in love with Semele. He approached her not in disguise, as he often did, but as a charming nobleman, veiled in mystery. It is said that the relationship between Zeus and Semele was hidden from the world, cloaked in secrecy, only one being dared to pry into it. Hera, the jealous and cunning wife of Zeus. Hera, you see, had a long memory and a deep well of resentment. When she discovered Zeus's infatuation with Semele, she didn't confront her husband. Instead, she did something far more methodically and cruel. Disguised as an old nursemaid, Hera approached Semele. She whispered doubts in her ear. Was it truly Zeus she had been meeting, or was it a mortal deceiving her? These poisonous thoughts took root, and Semele, young and unsure, asked Zeus for a favor. Zeus, perhaps out of love or guilt, swore on the river Styx the most unbreakable of oaths that he would give her anything she wished, and what she wished was this: to see him in his true divine form. It was a request born from uncertainty, but it sealed her fate. Zeus tried to dissuade her, but an oath on the Styx could not be revoked, so he revealed himself in his divine form, cloaked in lightning, radiant with divine fire, and Semele, a mortal, could not bear the sight. She perished instantly in the blaze of divine light, but not before Zeus snatched the unborn child from her womb. And so, Dionysus was born a second time. Zeus, determined to save his child, did something so bizarre that even the gods found it odd. He sewed the fetus into his own thigh. There, Dionysus gestated until he was ready to be born once more, making him the only god born twice, once from a mortal womb, and once from a god's body. You might think that such an origin would earn Dionysus immediate honor on Mount Olympus, but that wasn't the case. His birth was an embarrassment to some, a mystery to others, and a threat to Hera. Hera, still furious, refused to allow the child to be raised openly among the gods, and so Dionysus was hidden away. Zeus entrusted the infant Dionysus to Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger of the gods. Hermes took him to be raised in secrecy far from Mount Olympus, far from the jealous eyes of Hera. The godchild's first refuge was with Ino, Semele's sister, and her husband Athamat. But even disguised as a girl to avoid detection, Dionysus did not remain hidden for long. Hera discovered him. Her wrath fell not only on Dionysus, but on those who sheltered him. Madness descended upon Athamas and Ino, and their house was destroyed in tragedy. So Hermes whisked Dionysus away again. Some say he was taken to the nymphs of Mount Nysa, a location so mysterious that no one could ever quite agree on where it was. Ethiopia, India, Libya, Arabia. Each culture claimed a version of the mountain. But what is clear is that this place, wherever it was fertile, wild, and teeming with life. Here, among the nymphs and satyrs, Dionysus grew into something holy. Unique, he was neither fully of the gods nor entirely of men. He was shaped by wild nature, by fertility, by music, and by vine. It was here that Dionysus is said to have discovered the grapevine and the process of fermenting wine. He learned the rhythms of the earth, the strange alchemy that turned fruit into something intoxicating. He also learned joy and madness. The nymphs who raised him sang lullabies, not of order, but of transformation. The satyrs taught him to dance wildly, to celebrate the chaos in beauty. And Dionysus, for all his complicated origins, became something new, a god of dualities, life and death, joy and grief, madness and clarity, wine and war. But even in this sanctuary, Dionysus was not safe. He began to wander. His wanderings took him across lands near and far, where he spread the art of winemaking. To mortals, some welcomed him, others mocked or resisted. And each time he was resisted, strange things happened. One king tried to imprison Dionysus. His entire city was plunged into madness. Another tried to suppress the drinking rituals. His horses tore him apart, mistaking him for a beast. These tales weren't always glorious or triumphant, but they were consistent in one theme: resisting Dionysus often led to unraveling. What's most peculiar, however, is how Dionysus responded to both praise and punishment. He didn't lead with rage, like Ares. He didn't bestow justice, like Zeus. He didn't offer wisdom, like Athena. Instead, Dionysus offered transformation. His punishments were strange and poetic: vines bursting from stone walls, women abandoning their homes to dance in the forest, kings succumbing to hallucinations. By the time Dionysus reached adulthood, he was no longer just a wandering god. He had become a movement, and yet even then Mount Olympus had not formally accepted him. He had no throne, no place among the 12. That, however, would change soon. But before that final recognition, Dionysus would undertake one of the strangest and most treacherous journeys of any Greek god, a journey into the underworld. That it was not for conquest, or it was not for glory, it was for a woman, and it would reveal just how different Dionysus truly was. But before we descend into darkness and death, let us linger on this thought. Why would a god of wine and pleasure, of joy and celebration, willingly venture into the land of the dead? Why would the oddest party planner of ancient myth need to walk where souls go to fade? Into the underworld, Dionysus, and the rescue of his mother. When you think of the underworld in Greek mythology, certain names tend to dominate your imagination: Hades, Persephone, Cerberus, shadows, rivers, punishment. You imagine heroes like Orpheus or Heracles descending into its depths for love or glory. Rarely, however, do we consider Dionysus in this context. But Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, once made the strange and silent descent not for treasure or power but for his mother. Semele, the mortal woman who had died because she dared to see Zeus in his true form. She had perished in a flash of divine fire before Dionysus was even born. Her body was never recovered. Her spirit, like those of all mortals, passed into the underworld, the realm of Hades, where souls drift like smoke among the asphodel fields. And Dionysus, born twice, felt the pull of her absence, though he had never truly known her in life. He felt her absence as a wound in his identity. Who was he, really, if he was born of a mortal mother who had no resting place among the gods? Dionysus had wandered the earth. He had learned the secrets of the vine and the wildness of human spirit. But there was a hole in his story, and so he did something no other god of pleasure or madness had dared to do. He journeyed to the land of the dead. Now, gods did not casually walk into Hades. Even immortals avoided it, for the underworld had rules that did not always bend to Olympus. And Dionysus, whose identity straddled the line between mortal and god, was particularly at risk. Still, he went. Some say he disguised himself for the journey not as a warrior, but as a mortal priest of his own cult, cloaked in ivy and black robes, barefoot, with a crown of pine leaves. Others claim he carried a thyrsus, the sacred staff, wrapped in vine and topped with a pine cone, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of rebirth. But he did not go alone. With him came a companion, Persephonus, a shepherd from Argos who had once offered to guide Dionysus in exchange for a strange, cryptic promise. Persephonus, unlike other mortals, knew a secret passage, an ancient, lesser-known entrance to Hades near Lake Lerna, where old myths claimed the earth was thin and trembling. And so Dionysus entered. Not through the gates guarded by Cerberus, but through water and mist, through a passage old and sacred, known only to those who whispered with ghosts. Inside the underworld, the rules were different. Silence ruled, time lost meaning, and mortals, even divine-born ones, could lose themselves. But Dionysus was not like other gods, where others might have relied on strength or cunning. Dionysus had something else: charisma, strangeness, and the power of transformation. He passed through shadows, past rivers of forgetfulness and fields of murmuring souls. He was not stopped by Hades himself, not because Hades welcomed him, but because Dionysus brought something foreign to the underworld: celebration. One myth tells that Dionysus paused to dance among the dead, his feet stirring the ashes, his laughter echoing where none had laughed for centuries. Another tale claims he offered wine to the shade of Sisyphus, who paused just once in his eternal labor to taste it, before the boulder rolled once more. Eventually, Dionysus reached his goal. Similarly, she had remained a shadow, just another soul among millions. But when Dionysus approached, she recognized something in him, her child, her story not yet complete. And so, in an act rarely granted to mortals, Dionysus took her with him. How exactly he convinced Hades and Persephone is unclear. Some say he offered a trade. Others claim he performed a ritual older than the Olympians. A few versions whisper that Persephone, moved by the story of a son reclaiming his mother, allowed it out of quiet defiance to her own captivity. The end, Semele left the underworld a nearly impossible feat and ascended to Olympus, now immortal. This was not merely an act of divine rescue. It was a moment of cosmic rewriting. Semele, once a mortal woman burned by the truth of divinity, now stood among the gods. Zeus, in a gesture of completion, gave her a new name, Thyone, meaning the raging one, or more gently, she who was inspired by frenzy. Thyone joined the pantheon, but more importantly, Dionysus had rewritten his story. He was no longer the orphan of Olympus. He was the god who brought back his mother, the only god, in fact, to rescue a mortal from Hades and successfully integrate her into divine life. And this changed everything. It changed how the gods saw Dionysus not as a wild outsider, but as someone with power over life and death, madness and healing, wine and wisdom. It showed that Dionysus did not merely bring joy, he brought rebirth. Still, not all gods accepted him. Hera remained cold. Even Apollo, patron of reason and order, viewed Dionysus with suspicion. But Zeus, proud and perhaps grateful for the redemption of Semele, insisted that his son be given a throne on Mount Olympus. At last, Dionysus was among the 12, but even with a throne, he never truly stayed still. He did not like the marble halls and polished manners of Olympus. He preferred the mountains, the forests, the villages. He preferred barefoot dances at night, and music played on reeds and drums. He preferred the company of satyrs and maenads to gods of law and order. And so he returned to Earth, over and over again, each time bringing something strange, transformative, and uncontrollable. He would continue to spread the vine. He would invent rituals where followers danced until they forgot their own names. He would break the minds of kings and free the repressed thoughts of shepherds. And yet, at the center of all this chaos was an act of love. He had gone into the dark, for no glory, and returned with a mother he had never known, a god of madness. Yes, but also of memory. Still, one question remains. Dionysus had conquered mortality, had rewritten what was possible for gods and men. But if he could save one mortal, could he do it again? And more importantly, should he? What happens when a god of transformation touches the rules that bind even death? Madness in Thebes, the god returns home. Now that Dionysus had secured his place among the Olympians and brought his mother Semele to divine status, you might think his story would settle into a calmer rhythm. But Dionysus, as we've seen, is a god unlike any other, restless, unpredictable, and deeply tied to the human psyche. He never stayed in one place too long. After his travels across foreign lands and his descent into the underworld, Dionysus returned home, not to Olympus, to Thebes, the very city where Semele had once lived. Thebes, in central Greece, was no stranger to drama. It was the birthplace of many troubled myths, Oedipus, Antigone, the doomed house of Cadmus. Dionysus, too, was part of that lineage. But the people of Thebes had never acknowledged him. To them, Semele had died in disgrace, and her so-called son of Zeus was just another local legend gone mad. Dionysus came to Thebes not as a god demanding worship, but as a stranger, a wandering priest of his own cult. He arrived wearing women's clothing and a crown of ivy. His long hair flowed over his shoulders, and his eyes gleamed out with anger, but with something more unsettling, calm certainty. This was not the Dionysus of Olympus. This was the Dionysus who danced with maenads on mountaintops, who whispered secrets into the minds of sleeping shepherds, who brewed wine under moonlight and watched kings fall apart under their own control. He brought with him a small group of followers, women mostly known as maenads, or the raving ones. They came from different parts of Greece and Asia, their voices raised in chant and their movements wild but strangely synchronized. They followed no walls, obeyed no curfew, and danced until the stars disappeared. This behavior disturbed the Thebans, women abandoning hearth and home, rituals outside the temple, foreign songs in the streets. It was disorder, but what truly threatened the city was Dionysus's challenge to power. The king of Thebes at the time was Pentheus, the grandson of Cadmus and cousin of Dionysus through Semele. Pentheus was young, confident, and obsessed with order. He ruled with logic and discipline, and he viewed the new cult of Dionysus as dangerous nonsense, effeminate, foreign, and corrosive to proper Greek society. Pentheus issued decrees: no more dancing, no more mountain rituals, no more wine-fueled processions. He had Dionysian followers arrested and beaten. He dismissed the idea that Dionysus was a true god. He even mocked the story of Semele, calling her a liar who invented Zeus as an excuse for an illicit affair, and that is where Dionysus drew the line. But how does a god of madness punish arrogance? Not with lightning or spears but with a mirror. Dionysus didn't attack Pentheus, he simply reflected him. Slowly, methodically, he allowed the king's own doubts, desires, and pride to unravel him. The story unfolds like a slow-burning dream. Dionysus, still in disguise, allowed himself to be arrested. Pentheus interrogated him, expecting a madman, but instead, he found a serene figure who answered calmly, even playfully. When Pentheus mocked the god's long hair and robes, Dionysus gently invited him to try on the same clothing to better understand the madness he so feared. And Pentheus, curiously, agreed. It began as an investigation. Pentheus wanted to spy on the Maenads, who had now retreated to Mount Cithaeron, dancing and chanting in secret. He believed they were indulging in immoral behavior, and he wanted proof. Dionysus offered to help, but there was a condition. Pentheus must dress like a woman, whether out of arrogance, curiosity, or unconscious fascination. Pentheus agreed. He donned a flowing dress, tied his hair up, and accepted a thyrsus from Dionysus. Disguised and dazed, Pentheus followed the god into the mountains. There, hidden in the trees, he watched the Maenads, but what he saw did not match his fears. The women were not engaged in debauchery. They were in trance-like states, praising the gods, calling to nature, moving with eerie unity. Yet, the longer Pentheus watched, the more unstable he became. He imagined power in this chaos, imagined controlling the frenzy. He became drunk, not on wine, but on the illusion of command. And then Dionysus removed the illusion. The Maenads saw Pentheus, not as a king, but as a wild animal, a lion, perhaps, or a young bull. In their trance, they believed he was a threat, and they tore him apart. Leading them was Agave, Pentheus's own mother, who had been among the women converted to Dionysus's cult. She held her son's head high, believing it to be a trophy from a hunt, not realizing it was her child. Only when the madness lifted did she see the truth. The city fell silent, and Dionysus, no longer in disguise, revealed himself. That it was not revenge, it was instruction. See, Dionysus never forced worship upon people in the traditional sense. He simply offered transformation and waited. Those who accepted were changed. Those who resisted were often destroyed not by his hand, but by their own refusal to let go. What makes Dionysus unique among the Olympians is that he represents both ecstasy and consequence. He is not only the god of parties, but the god of what happens when one surrenders to forces beyond logic. In Thebes, he left behind no temple, no army, no throne, only silence and reflection. After the death of Pentheus, Dionysus did not remain in Thebes. He vanished once more into the wilderness, but his cult remained, and over time, it spread through Greece, to Thrace, to the islands, and beyond. Dionysus's rituals became known as the Bacchic mysteries, secret ceremonies involving dance, music, masks, wine, and transformation. Unlike the polished rituals of Apollo or the civic festivals of Athena, these were visceral, personal, and profoundly emotional. They spoke to the side of humans that most gods ignored, the irrational. By the time of classical Athens, Dionysus had become essential. His festivals gave rise to tragedy and comedy, the birth of Greek theater. Playwrights like Euripides used his stories to explore human limits, divine cruelty, and emotional collapse. And always, the same pattern emerged. Dionysus arrives, is underestimated, and is revealed. He represents the part of us that cannot be reasoned with, the part that mourns deeply, laughs suddenly, dances wildly, or drinks to forget, the part that needs ritual to make sense of chaos. Today, we remember Dionysus as the god of wine, madness, fertility, and drama. But in his earliest stories, in the tale of his strange birth, his descent into the underworld, and the unraveling of Pentheus, we see something else. A god who does not conquer, but reveals. A god who offers transformation, but not without risk. And perhaps that is why his myths still feel oddly modern, because even now we live with tension between order and chaos, reason and emotion, repression and release. Dionysus is not just the party planner of the ancient world, he is the question we still haven't answered: what happens when you stop pretending to be in control? Story 2. The bread, the olive, and the citizen. How food built ancient Athens. Grains and governance, daily life in the agora. When you think of Athens, your mind likely jumps to philosophy, democracy, the Parthenon, and marble statues of gods. with idealized features. Names like Socrates, Pericles, and Plato come easily. But beneath all the lofty ideas and architectural marvels was something far more basic, something even the greatest. Minds relied on bread, cheese, olives, and fish. Lots of fish. Before Athenian citizens could debate justice in the agora or carve their names into stone, they needed energy. And that energy came from wheat and barley, olive oil and wine, and whatever the sea provided that day. To understand Athens, truly understand it too, must start not in the temples, but in the kitchen and the market. A city runs on grain. Let's begin with bread, the quiet, essential hero of the ancient Athenian diet. In the 5th century BCE, Athens had reached the height of its power. Its naval fleet dominated the Aegean. Its playwrights were celebrated across the Mediterranean, but at the heart of the city's survival was the import and distribution of grain. You see, the land around Athens was rocky and dry. The Attic soil, though good for olives and grapes, didn't grow much grain, and so the city became reliant on imported wheat and barley, shipped in from places like Egypt, Sicily, and the Black Sea region. The port of Piraeus buzzed with activity every day. Merchant ships arrived bearing sacks of grain, and Athenians tracked their arrival with almost religious intensity. Grain prices were discussed as often as politics. Magistrates, known as setophilakes, grain guardians, were tasked with monitoring the market and preventing speculation. Grain was power. It fueled the stomachs of both rich and poor, and any disruption in supply could shake the entire city. The wealthy often ate artisar, fine white bread made from imported wheat flour, soft and smooth. The poor relied on maza, more rustic, coarse bread made from barley meal, soaked in water or wine, shaped into patties, and baked or grilled. And while it might sound plain, this bread was often flavored with herbs, cheese, or honey when possible. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. Now imagine the daily scene in the agora, the central marketplace of Athens. The sun rises. The stone streets begin to fill. Merchants lay out their goods. The smell of freshly baked bread, olives soaked in brine, figs, and garlic begins to drift across the square. Young boys run messages. Old men discuss politics. Women shop early, hoping to beat the crowds. And in every corner, there is talk of the grain boats. Did they arrive? Will the price hold? It's not the story of heroes or gods, but it is the story of life. Olive oil, the liquid gold of the polis. Bread filled the belly, but olive oil defined culture. Olive trees were everywhere, twisted gray-limbed trees that thrived in the dry soil of Attica. Some groves were considered sacred, believed to be gifts of the goddess Athena herself. In fact, one of the founding myths of the city says Athena beat Poseidon in a contest to name the city by offering the people an olive tree, a gift more practical and enduring than a salty spring. The olive harvest took place in late autumn. Families would gather beneath the trees, collecting olives by hand or with sticks. The olives were then crushed, sometimes with stone mills, sometimes by foothand. The oil extracted in a slow, laborious process, but once produced, it became essential. Athenians used olive oil for cooking, for lighting their homes, for bathing, and even for religious rituals. Athletes rubbed it into their bodies before competitions. The dead were anointed with it before burial. Babies were blessed with it, and the finest oil pressed from unripe green olives was stored in special clay jars known as amphorae, painted with scenes of gods, games, and harvests. These were given as prizes in athletic competitions and used in trade across the Mediterranean. Imagine it. A single tree, carefully tended, could serve a family for generations. In its shade, people rested. From its fruit they made light and food, and in its oil they found both wealth and identity. When Pericles spoke of the greatness of Athens, he didn't mention olives, but every citizen listening to him had likely harvested one, cheese, figs, and the day's meals. While bread and oil formed the foundation of the Athenian diet, there were other staples that brought flavor and satisfaction. Goats and sheep were more common than cows, and their milk was turned into cheesy, some soft and fresh, others salted and aged. Cheese was crumbled onto bread, mixed into porridge, or eaten on its own with herbs. Figs, both fresh and dried, were another favorite. They were easy to grow, sweet, and filling. Athenian boys were even nicknamed sycophantai, or fig, a term that evolved into the modern word sycophant. Its origin: informers who reported illegal fig exports because yes, figs were valuable enough to spark regulation. Meat was less common in daily meals. It was mostly reserved for sacrifices and festivals. But seafood, that was the true protein source of the city. Fish for all if you could afford it. Athens was a coastal city. and the sea shaped its diet as much as its politics. Fishmongers lined the marketplace. Silver-scaled sardines, anchovies, eels from Lake Cope, and even octopus were sold at stalls, wrapped in vine leaves or served grilled over charcoal. The smell of grilled fish was as common in Athenian neighborhoods as the sound of sandals. On stone, the wealthy might dine on red mullet or imported tuna, delicacies from far-off waters, but even the poor could afford salted anchovies or dried cuttlefish, cheap, pungent, and satisfying when paired with barley bread. One popular dish, fish cooked with vinegar and leeks, another salted fish fried in olive oil and sprinkled with herbs. Food was not just sustenance, it was ritual, identity, and sometimes politics. There were laws regulating the price of fish. In plays by Aristophanes, characters argue about fishmongers' greed. In one case, a man divorces his wife over how she prepares squid, and yet this mattered deeply, because in a city like Athens where democracy required daily participation, food was the difference between engagement and exhaustion. Dining together, most Athenians didn't eat in large feasts. Meals were simple and quick, a morning barley cake, a midday lunch of olives and bread, and a shared dinner at sundown. But in the symposium, a drinking party held by the elite. See the social side of food. Men would recline on couches, drink watered-down wine from shared cups, and eat small bites, nuts, fruits, fish, pastries. As they drank, they debated philosophy, told stories, and sang songs. The food wasn't extravagant, but the experience was immersive. Yet for the average Athenian, the daily meal was eaten sitting upright, with family or fellow workers. Hands, not utensils, were most common. Watered wine was drunk carefully. To excess, too much wine was a moral issue, not just a personal failing. It's strange to think, the same city that produced Plato's Republic also fretted over the price of garlic, and whether the anchovies were too salty this year. But that's the reality of ancient life. Philosophy and politics were born not in palaces, but in cities fed by barley, olives, and fish. And the great thinkers, they walked among the market stalls, buying figs and cheese just like everyone else. But how did Athens, so reliant on imports and daily labor, protect its food supply during war? How did Pericles feed the entire population when Sparta invaded the countryside? What happened when the grain ships failed to arrive? A god born from a thigh and raised by confusion. You are lying still, perhaps in bed, perhaps on a soft chair, with your thoughts quieting and your breath steady. Let us go back, so far that the world feels wrapped in marble dust and olive oil. Back to a time when gods lived on mountains, mortals feared the sea, and wine was more than a drink, it was a divine inheritance. In this soft-edged corner of ancient memory, there was a god who didn't quite fit in with the others. You've heard of Zeus with his lightning bolts, of Athena with her gleaming spear, and perhaps of Apollo, radiant and precise. But have you truly thought about Dionysus? Yes, Dionysus, the god of wine, and madness, and theater, and parties. A god you might imagine swirling a goblet beneath a moon-drenched fig tree. But there is more to him than grapes and songs. Much more and much stranger. Let's begin not with his feasts or his followers, but with his very odd beginning. Dionysus was not born in the usual way. In fact, it might be most accurate to say he was not born at all but twice, which was not unusual in Greek myth, but still deeply unsettling. His mother was Semele, a mortal woman from Thebes. She was lovely and curious, and had the kind of eyes that made gods make mistakes. Zeus noticed her, and, if you know Zeus, that's never just a compliment. He fell in love, and, as he often did, he visited her in secret, cloaked in mystery and mist. Semele, like many mortals dazzled by the divine, became pregnant. Not long after, she made the mistake of wanting to see her lover in his true form, not just as a gentle breeze or golden mist, but as Zeus, king of Olympus, god of thunder, in his full blazing glory. Zeus, despite a flicker of concern, obliged, and Semele, because no mortal can behold a god in full and live, was burned to ash by his divine radiance. But she was pregnant. Zeus, in a rare moment of panic and tenderness, reached into the smoking remains of her body and rescued the half-formed fetus of Dionysus. And then, because there were no other options, he sewed the unborn child into his own thigh. Yes, his thigh. And from that thigh, in due time, Dionysus was born, fully divine, half-mortal, and wholly peculiar. The Greeks, pragmatic as ever, did not spend too much time questioning why a god's thigh was a suitable womb. Instead, they accepted it as part of the story, a detail one simply nods at while pouring more wine. But a child born of a mortal mother and a divine father was not exactly welcomed on Olympus. Hera, Zeus's wife, was particularly displeased. You might imagine how awkward the family dinners were. Hera's jealousy was legendary, and she was not above taking it out on the children of her husband's infidelities. So Zeus, to protect Dionysus, hid him. He was sent away to the edges of the world, first to be raised by nymphs in the secluded Valley of Nysa, place not marked on any map and probably not even real, which suited the god of illusions perfectly. The nymphs cared for him gently. They taught him to coax juice from grapes, to play with vines, and how to vanish behind a veil of ivy. Some stories say the great Silenus, around and usually intoxicated satyr, also raised him, teaching him songs older than the seas. From early on, Dionysus was not like other gods. He wandered a lot. In fact, he spent most of his early godhood not on Olympus, but drifting across the world in disguises. Sometimes a boy, sometimes a girl, sometimes neither. He wore dresses when it pleased him and grew his hair long. He blurred lines, confused expectations, and seemed quite delighted about it. And everywhere he went, things began to grow. Vines tangled indoors, grapes ripened out of season, springs turned to wine. But so did other things. Laughter turned to crying. Joy tipped over into madness. People danced until they collapsed or wept for no reason. Dionysus's presence was not always welcome, but it was always unforgettable. One such episode occurred when he tried to return to his birthplace Thebes. You might assume he would be celebrated, but Thebes had long forgotten Semele and had no love for strange gods wearing silken robes and calling themselves divine. King Pentheus, stern and skeptical, refused to recognize Dionysus. He declared the god a fraud and his cult an offense to order. He banned the wild rituals and the forest dances, forbade the women from joining Dionysus's processions. Now, Dionysus was not a god who punished with fire or flood. His wrath was not immediate, it was theatrical. Instead of storms, he used suggestion. He did not hurl bolts, he whispered. He appeared in disguise. Of course, a soft-spoken stranger, a foreign prophet. He told Pentheus that he could teach him about the mystery rites, about the women dancing in the woods. He promised secrets. The king, curious and slightly unmoored by the stranger's gaze, agreed to follow him, but there was a condition. He must wear a disguise, a dress. And so Pentheus, king of Thebes, walked out into the hills dressed as a woman. He wanted to spy on the revelers. He wanted to catch them in their wildness. But what he found was not drunken chaos. What he found was ecstasy, a trance of freedom so complete it unraveled his sense of self. And what happened next was grim. The women, in their frenzied devotion, saw Pentheus not as a man, not even as a king, but as a wild animal, a lion, perhaps, and they tore him apart. Among them was his own mother, who only realized the truth when the madness wore off and she saw her son's blood on her hands. That is the edge Dionysus danced upon. Beauty and horror, joy and ruin. He was never just the god of wine. He was the god of what lies beneath, the urges we suppress, the laughter that turns into sobs, the desire to lose oneself completely. But if he was so strange, so unruly, so full of contradiction, why was he ever allowed back onto Olympus? That is a question worth asking. You see, Dionysus earned his seat. Unlike many gods who were simply given their place in the pantheon, Dionysus had to prove he belonged. His journey was not just one of geography, it was spiritual. He went into the underworld to rescue his mother. He guided the living and raised the dead. He taught mortals how to survive grief by losing themselves, if only for a night, in wine, in ritual, in storytelling. Perhaps this is why he became the god of theater. The stage, after all, is a place where you can pretend to be someone else, where masks are sacred, where madness becomes art. And so, Dionysus was accepted. Late, reluctant, but real. He became the final god of Olympus the 13th at the table. A number the Greeks did not mind, though later cultures would see it as unlucky. To them, Dionysus was necessary. He was the pressure valve of society, the divine embodiment of relief, of forgetting, of catharsis. But not everyone saw it that way. There were philosophers who warned against his influence, Stoics who preferred reason to revelry, cities that banned his cult, people who said his rites were too wild, too dangerous. So how did he survive the centuries? How did a god of intoxication and illusion endure while others faded? Could it be that Dionysus was never really about parties at all? Could it be that he represented something deeper, something about human nature itself? The answers, like Dionysus himself, are slippery, and so we are left with an image, a young god, walking barefoot, through foreign lands, wearing ivy in his hair, followed by a train of women and beasts and musicians. He smiles, but not always kindly. He offers wine, but it might taste like truth. He welcomes all, but only if they are willing to lose something of themselves. What does it mean to follow Dionysus, and why did his cult inspire both joy and fear, even among the gods? That is a story for another night. From madness to memory, the legacy of Dionysus. The theater quiets. The torches flicker low, the wine runs dry, but Dionysus he remains, not in the flesh, but in memory, myth and marble. Now that we've traveled through his wanderings and his strange role in the Olympian pantheon, we arrive at the most curious part of all. Why was this god of revelry, madness, and vines also the one the Greeks turned to for understanding the line between control and chaos? This section takes us not to another battlefield or Bacchic parade, but to the dusty corners of Greek daily life, village festivals, quiet vineyards, and open-air theaters. Because Dionysus was not merely a character in a myth, he was a presence, a rhythm in the year, a reminder of both joy and danger, control and surrender. Let's begin in Athens, the theater of Dionysus drama as devotion. Every spring, Athens hosted the city Dionysia festival that transformed an entire city into a stage, but don't picture confetti or balloons. Picture masks, silence, sweat, and chanting. The festival lasted several days, and the entire polis participated. Dramatists presented new tragedies and comedies in the open-air theater of Dionysus, nestled on the southern slope of the Acropolis. But why Dionysus? What did plays about war, betrayal, and sorrow have to do with wine and ivy leaves? Everything. For the Greeks, Dionysus wasn't only the god of wine, he was the god of transformation, of becoming someone or something else. In the theater, an actor wore a mask and became a king, a slave, a god, a woman. In the audience, you became part of the chorus, the story, the sorrow. It was a controlled madness. The same energy that tore Pentheus apart in Euripides. The Bacchae was now channeled into civic reflection. People laughed at Aristophanes' comedies or wept at Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. But through it all, they felt what the Greeks called catharsis, a purging of emotion, a shared moment. And at the center of that moment was Dionysus, the quiet reminder that even reason must bow to emotion, if only for a time. The vine and the plough, Dionysus in the fields, away from Athens, in the humble vineyards of Thessaly or the dusty roads of Boeotia. Dionysus still made his presence known. Farmers thanked him for the grapes. Winemakers called on him for a good harvest. The cultivation of wine wasn't just agricultural, it was spiritual. Wine was more than a drink. It was the medium through which people crossed boundaries, from sober to tipsy, from mortal to divine. Dionysus stood at the gate of that transformation, but, like all thresholds, it was dangerous. Too much wine meant madness, too little, and you missed the joy. Dionysus wasn't a god of excess, he was a god of balance, of letting go, but not falling apart. In rural festivals called the Lesser Dionysia, villagers paraded with phallic symbols, sang songs, and celebrated the end of winter. The rituals could be raucous, but they were grounded in rhythm. They reminded the Greeks that even the oddest gods had their place in the natural cycle. Madness, gender, and outsiders. Dionysus was never fully at home among the Olympians. His arrival was always a bit delayed, his throne never quite settled. He blurred lines between god and mortal, man and woman, sanity and frenzy. He was often depicted with long flowing hair, soft features, and a robe more like a woman's than a warrior's armor. He surrounded himself with women Menads and sometimes appeared with satyrs and other liminal creatures. Dionysus was the outsider's god. For those on the margins, women, foreigners, even slaves, he offered something unusual in the ancient world. Permission to break roles, to feel emotion deeply, to dance wildly under the moonlight. And yet, those who resisted him, those who clung too tightly to control, were often undone. Think of King Pentheus, torn limb from limb by his own mother, under Dionysus's spell, or the daughters of Minyas, who mocked Dionysus and were transformed into bats or driven mad. The lesson wasn't subtle. Ignore Dionysus at your peril. Repress emotion, and it will return louder, wilder, and less forgiving. Legacy and silence. By the time of the Roman Empire, Dionysus had become a name more familiar to us today. His image evolved, but the essence remained. A god who showed up late, brought wine, and disrupted expectations. Eventually, Christianity would arrive, and Dionysus, like many of the old gods, would fade from temples and festivals. But not completely. In some Christian traditions, wine remained sacred. Ritual became performance. Theatrical liturgy echoed the stages of Athens, and behind it, although unnamed, was the spirit of Dionysus. Today, we still watch dramas to feel something deeper. We still gather around wine to soften the edges of daily life. We still need reminders to loosen control, to laugh, to cry, to sow now. As the moon rises over the ruins of a once bustling theater, and the wind moves through forgotten vineyards, you might wonder, was Dionysus just a god of grapes and parties? Or was he the ancient world's way of saying, feel, mourn, celebrate, break the rules, but only for a night? What if behind the laughter and madness he was the Greeks' quietest, strangest way of finding peace? Sleep now, and dream of ivy leaves, silver goblets, and the hum of distant pipes. Dionysus dances. Story 3. The Olive Press and the Scroll. Daily life in ancient Athens. The potter's mourning from roosters. Crow to agorous hum. Let single quotes take a walk through the city of Athens, not the Athens you might know today, bustling with tourists and traffic, but the Athens of the 5th century BCE, when the city was at its intellectual and political peak. But its heartbeat was made of far more ordinary rhythms. You awaken not in a marble palace, but in a modest clay house with a thatched roof. The sun hasn't risen yet, but a rooster has already let his opinion be known. The smell of ash from the evening fire lingers in the corners of the home. A family of 5 stirs from their mat straw stuffed into sacks spread neatly along the walls. Your name might be Demetrios. You're not a philosopher or a politician. You're a potter, one of the thousands of craftspeople whose hands literally shaped Athens. Today, as with most days, you'll walk to your workshop just outside the Dipolon gate, rubbing sleep from your eyes, stomach empty, fingers already flexing in anticipation of hours spent at the wheel. Before that, your wife Myrene kneads barley, dough in a simple stone bowl, her fingers moving without thought. She will bake flat loaves in the hearth, feed the children, and save the rest for when you return home. There's no concept of a weekend. Days are dictated by the sun and the seasons, not leisure. The city hums slowly to life. You pull on your himatayan, worn and patched, and step out onto the uneven stone road. Your neighbors, other craftsmen, slaves, and freemen greet you with a nod. No small talk, not yet. The agora will be filled with voices soon enough, but first, a stop at the public fountain house near the city center. Water is free here, drawn from aqueducts fed by springs in the surrounding hills. As you wait in line with others, some slaves, carrying heavy amphorae, others like yourself carrying small jugs, you overhear talk of a new law being debated in the assembly. Something about taxation on imported olive oil. You listen, nod, and say nothing. Politics is for those with time and property. You have neither. By the time you reach your workshop, the sun is just brushing the hills. The kiln sits cold from the night before, its belly blackened with soot. Rows of unfired pots and bowls, others storage vessels weighed on wooden shelves. Still damp, the scent of wet clay is sharp, earthy. You like it. The wheel, a simple turntable powered by your foot, is where you'll spend the better part of the morning. Each vessel must be carefully shaped, left to dry, painted, and then fired. Nothing wasted. A cracked pot is repurposed, broken pieces becoming astracode, those small shards used to vote on the exile of citizens. It's an odd thought. Your failed cup might help banish a man from the city. Outside, the city's heartbeat picks up. Children run barefoot through alleyways. Priests in temple robes sweep steps of dust. Merchants call out in the agora setting. Up tables of figs, wine, cheese, and fish caught at dawn. Over it all, the Acropolis looms, its temples to Athena casting long shadows. You take a break mid-morning. There's no formal lunch hour, but most artisans allow themselves a pause when the sun rises high. A fig, a piece of bread, maybe a splash of diluted wine. Conversation turns to a local scandal. A rich man's son caught carousing in the temple grounds. The older potter beside you snorts. Let him spend a day at the wheel. That'll teach him the gods' patience. And you think, perhaps it would. After lunch you paint. The brushes are fine reeds chewed at one end. The paint is a slip liquid clay rich in iron. You're careful as you sketch a centaur onto the belly of a crater. Myths are in demand. Even the ordinary men of Athens want their wine mixed in bowls that speak of heroes. But there's something ironic here, isn't there? These epic tales of Odysseus, Achilles, and Heracles, lovingly by hands that have never left the city walls, never held a sword, never faced a cyclops. Still, the customers are happy, and that's what matters. As dusk comes, you cover the unfired pots and douse the fire slowly. You stretch your saw back, sweep the clay dust from your skin, and start the walk home. But before going back, you take a detour to the agora again. Now, it's less crowded, the stores are closing, and the air smells of olives, old cheese, and people. You listen to a man on a makeshift platform ranting about Sparta. Another group discusses Socrates. He made that boy cry again, someone says with a chuckle. Too many questions. You smile. You've never spoken to Socrates, though you've seen him. He passes by sometimes, barefoot and what he'd asking bakers about justice and butchers about the soul. What would he ask you? You wonder. What is the form of a pot? What is the virtue of clay? You wouldn't know how to answer. At home, the evening meal is shared in silence, broken only by your daughter's story of a dog chasing a goat in the temple yard. Your wife chuckles, your son pokes the fire with a stick. You eat your lentils, your olives, your bread dipped in oil. Later, you lie in bed, staring at the rafters. Tomorrow will be the same. The wheel, the kill, the marketplace, the voices, the myths painted in clay. But as you drift to sleep, you wonder, do the gods care about pots? Do they look down from Olympus and notice the curve of a jug, the handle of a cup, the way your brush strokes try to imitate their stories? Or do they only see the grand battles, the temple festivals, the speeches in the assembly? And if so, what about you? Liquid gold and the land of stone and sunlight. You're lying on a stone bench under the dappled shadow of an olive tree. It's late afternoon in ancient Greece, somewhere near Athens perhaps, or a dusty village tucked into the hills of Crete. A soft breeze rustles through the silvery green leaves above, and the scent of crushed olives lingers faintly in the air. You wouldn't think much of the small, gnarled trees dotting the hillside until someone tells you this. In the ancient world, this seemingly unimpressive fruit tree built empires, launched trade wars, and greased the wheels of civilization itself. The story of olive oil, yes, the same stuff you drizzle on salad or dip your bread into, begins long before the Greeks claimed it as their own. In fact, archaeologists trace its origins to the Levant, modern-day Syria, Israel, and Palestine, where people first domesticated the olive tree around 6,000 years ago. But it was in the Mediterranean, particularly Greece, where olive oil grew. From a household staple to a civilizational cornerstone. By the time of the Mycenaeans, 1600 to 1100 BCE, olive oil was already a commodity of remarkable value. In fact, Linear B tablets, those clay slabs with early Greek writing, contain detailed records of olive oil distribution. They reveal a bureaucracy so dull and methodical it would put a modern spreadsheet to shame. Oil was tallied in jars, measured in standard units called amphorae, and allocated for everything from cooking to cosmetics to religious sacrifice. Yes, in ancient Greece, olive oil wasn't just food, it was soap, skin, lotion, perfume, base, lamp fuel, and a sacred offering, all rolled into one viscous liquid. Now, imagine being a bureaucrat in Mycenae. Your entire job is to keep track of who receives how many jars of oil and for what purpose. A palace scribe might carefully press stylus to clay, noting that 2 amphorae were given to a local priest for use in a temple, while 4 more went to a bathhouse in town. Dull work, perhaps, but essential. Olive oil, after all, was the lifeblood of the palace economy. In time, as Greece evolved from city-states to a cultural powerhouse, olive oil's importance only grew. The very landscape was transformed by it. Olive trees, drought-resistant and hardy, became the crop of choice across rocky and infertile lands where little else thrived. They needed time, yes, about 15 years to mature, but once grown, a single tree could produce oil for centuries. Families passed down olive groves like inheritance gold. In fact, the penalty for damaging an olive tree in Athens could be exile or death. That's how seriously the Greeks took it. In cities like Athens, olive oil even played a role in politics and education. Every year, during the Panathenaic Games, an early model for the Olympics, winners didn't receive medals. No athletes were awarded massive quantities of olive oil, sometimes hundreds of gallons. These were stored in intricately painted amphorethos, tall ceramic jars with narrow necks and handles, and could be sold on the open market for a small fortune. In effect, the athlete became a minor oil baron overnight, and oil was not just a reward, it was part of the event itself. In the palestra, the ancient wrestling gym, athletes would coat themselves in olive oil before competition, not for beauty, although that helped. The oil was thought to warm the muscles and make the body more limber. Before and after training, wrestlers would be scraped clean with a curved tool called a strigular routine that sounds simple, but was often done slowly, methodically. The oil, sweat, and dust formed a paste called gloios. which was sometimes collected and sold for medicinal use. Yes, people actually paid for used athlete oil, but the most sacred use of olive oil was in religious life. The Greeks believed the first olive tree was planted by Athena herself. According to the myth, Poseidon and Athena competed to win the city of Athens. Poseidon offered a spring, while Athena struck the ground with her spear and grew the first olive tree. The Athenians judged the tree more valuable and, thus the city bore her name. In the sanctuary of Athena on the Acropolis, a single sacred olive tree stood protected by temple walls, believed to be the original tree from myth. Its cuttings were planted across the region and fiercely protected. Olive oil was burned in lamps inside temples, offered to the gods in libations, and used to anoint sacred statues. In Greek religious life, light was not just practical, it was symbolic. Burning olive oil created a steady flame, which represented clarity, reason, and piety. In many households, a small oil lamp might remain lit continuously as a gesture to Hestia, goddess of the hearth. If you were a merchant in ancient Athens, chances are your livelihood involved oil. Greek traders carried it in sealed amphorae across the Mediterranean to Egypt, to Carthage, even to far-off Gaul. Amphorae were often stamped or painted to indicate the city of origin and the oil's quality. Athenian oil, particularly that from the Academy Grove, was so prized that it became a luxury export. To avoid fraud, merchants sometimes branded their clay jars or sealed them with unique stoppers. But even in its most mundane uses, olive oil pervaded daily life. The wealthy perfumed it with herbs like thyme or marjoram. It was massaged into skin after a bath. It was mixed with ashes to make soap, or simply poured over vegetables and fish for flavor. And in the colder months, it kept homes lit and warm. Unlike modern electric bulbs, an oil lamp requires constant tending. You trim the wick, you refill the bowl, you sit beside the faint golden glow and read by it, or talk, or sleep. In this way, olive oil connected the sacred, the practical, and the sensual. It brought light into dark homes, preserved the skin of warriors, soothed the gods in their temples, and flavored the meals of both kings and peasants. But its success also had consequences, because as the demand for olive oil grew, forests began to shrink. Olive trees thrived on rocky hills, but they required land and lots of it. Farmers began clearing wild groves, cutting trees for fuel and making space for new olive orchards. By the classical period, scholars like Plato were already lamenting the deforestation of Attica. The land, once rich with woodland, had been scraped bare. All that remained, he said, were the bones of the earth in soils, eroded hills, and dusty winds. Still, the olive oil economy kept expanding. Wealthy citizens invested in groves like land speculators. Entire towns centered around production. Slaves and hired laborers harvested the fruit, often using hand rakes or shaking branches to make the olives fall onto cloth nets. The fruit was then washed, crushed by stone presses, and left to sit in large vats so the oil could separate and rise. This wasn't fast work, it was slow, methodical, and labor-intensive. In a world without machinery, producing a gallon of oil could take hours, yet the result was pure gold. It's easy to forget today, when we see olive oil in every grocery aisle, that this humble product once shaped trade routes, fueled economies, and lit the darkest corners of ancient homes. It was part of love, war, ritual, and daily labor. And though it's hard to imagine olive oil as the foundation of an empire, that's precisely what it became. Still, one question remains. If olive oil was so central to Greek life, spiritually and politically, what happened when Greece fell? What became of this liquid gold when new empires rose and the old ways faded into history? Cults, clay cups, and the grape that traveled. You might not think much about it when you pour yourself a glass of wine or pass a vineyard by the road, but grapes and what they became have shaped cultures, trade, and spirituality for over 7,000 years. In this section, we'll start not with Dionysus himself, but with something far older and perhaps more quietly powerful: the cultivation of the grapevine and the boring logistics of early wine production. Long before wild revelry and temples to gods of intoxication, there were ceramic pots, tired farmers, and an agricultural revolution that changed everything, not with swords or speeches, but with something as seemingly mundane as fermented juice. Let's begin in Neolithic Georgia. Around 6000 BCE, archaeologists working in the foothills south of Tbilisi uncovered ancient clay pots with traces of tartaric acid, the signature residue left behind by grape fermentation. These weren't ornate amphorae painted with satyrs and wild dancers. They were simple, utilitarian vessels, perhaps even undecorated, but within them, we find the earliest evidence of deliberate winemaking, not accidental fermentation, not spoiled fruit, but intentional craftsmanship passed from one generation to the next. It's quiet history, the kind that happens over long stretches of time. A family notices their crushed grapes bubble after a few days. Someone dares to taste it. It makes their head feel light. The community starts repeating the process. Eventually, they store it, share it, and maybe even offer it in ceremonies. From Georgia, grape cultivation spread slowly but steadily through the Fertile Crescent, into Mesopotamia, into Anatolia, into Egypt. But unlike grain or olives, grapes required particular care. The vines were fragile. The yield could vary. The fermentation process depended on weather and timing. And yet, people kept doing it by 3000 BCE. The Egyptians had incorporated wine into religious rituals and royal life. Tomb inscriptions describe offerings of wine to the gods and the dead. Clay jars in the tomb of Scorpion I, a pre-dynastic Egyptian king, still contained traces of ancient wine when they were unearthed. You can picture the rows of amphorae stacked carefully beside his remains, each marked with symbols describing vineyard origin, production date, and intended ceremonial use. But this was not wine as you might imagine it. Ancient wines were thick, often spiced or diluted with water or even seawater. The Greeks, later on, found the Persian style of drinking wine straight, undiluted, barbaric. In their view, only uncivilized people failed to mix water with wine. Wine was more than a beverage. It was a marker of civilization, status, and restraint. And yet, there's something curious. As wine moved westward into the Aegean world and the Greek mainland around 2000 BCE, it didn't just arrive as a product, it arrived as an idea. Vineyards were planted, yes, clay vessels were shaped and sealed with pine resin, but the Greeks, who loved classification and thought deeply about everything from ethics to geometry, soon wrapped wine in mythology, spirituality, and rules. One of the oldest Greek literary works, Homer's Odyssey, mentions wine in sacred contexts. When Odysseus blinds the Cyclops Polyphemus, he first lulls him into sleep with strong, sweet wine. The wine is described as thick and syrupy, needing 20 parts water to be drinkable. Again, not just drink, but something closer to a potion, a gift with power tied to hospitality and cunning. But it was in the following centuries, between 800 BCE and 500 BCE, that wine truly entered the Greek religious imagination. With it came the birth, or perhaps formal invention, of a god who would come to represent the most unusual aspects of Greek religious life, Dionysus. Dionysus didn't appear fully formed from the start. Early mentions of him are fragmented. Some scholars believe he was a foreign import, perhaps from Thrace or Phrygia. Others think he represented an older chthonic spirit, slowly absorbed into the Greek pantheon. What is clear is this: by the time classical Athens was thriving, Dionysus was firmly rooted in the culture but always slightly apart from the others. He wasn't like Apollo, god of rationality and light. He wasn't like Ares, god of war, or Poseidon, god of the sea. Dionysus was a god of the margins of theater, transformation, intoxication, and loss of control. The grapevine was his symbol, but so was the mask, the veil, and the thyrsus, a staff wrapped in ivy and topped with a pinecone. His followers, Maenads and Satyrs, danced in forests and on mountaintops. Their rituals often blurred the line between reverence and frenzy. But even before the wild festivals, there were symposiums. The Greek symposium was a structured drinking party, typically held by aristocratic men. They reclined on couches, sipped diluted wine from kylix's broad, shallow cups, and engaged in conversation, poetry, or philosophical debate. The host managed the wine, how much was served, how strong it was, who drank when. Drinking was not about getting drunk. It was about controlled pleasure, social bonding, and intellectual display. And yet, at the center of the symposium stood Dionysus. Paintings on the calyxes often showed him watching from the center of the cup, his image appearing only after the wine had been consumed. It's here that things start to feel more complex, because for the Greeks, wine wasn't just for pleasure or ceremony. It became a metaphor, a tool for crossing threshold, between sobriety and intoxication, between self and other, between order and chaos. Even the act of mixing wine with water was symbolic. Apollo and Dionysus were thought to be opposites, one of reason, one of ecstasy, but both were necessary. The proper mixing of wine mirrored the ideal balance between those two forces. Wine connected the mundane with the sacred, the everyday with the divine. And so, vineyards continued to spread across the Mediterranean. Some were owned by aristocrats, others tended by humble farmers. Clay amphorae were stamped with production dates. Ships carried wine to distant colonies. And slowly, across centuries, Dionysus followed, his image trailing behind the jars and vines. It is here, in this blend of agriculture, trade, and theology, that we see how wine became more than a drink. It became a framework, an almost invisible structure, around which social and religious life revolved. But what made Dionysus so unusual among the Olympians? Why did his followers often dress as animals or tear animals apart with their bare hands in ritual frenzy? And how did the worship of wine's god evolve into the theatrical traditions that shaped Western drama? Festivals, madness, and the quiet fade of Dionysus. The Dionysian cult was never meant to be quiet. It was designed for noise, wild music, ecstatic cries, the crackle of torches, and the thump of dancing feet in dark forests. It was, by nature, an expression of joy and agony at once. But as the centuries progressed, the very culture that embraced Dionysus so fully began to turn him into something more symbolic than spiritual, more literary than lived. Still, during its peak, the cult was unlike anything the ancient world had seen, and in the sleepy rhythms of ancient society, it left a strange but lasting pulse. The festivals of Dionysus, order in the chaos. Though known for chaos, Dionysian festivals had structure. The city Dionysia of Athens, one of the largest, was a state-sponsored event held every spring. It was less a chaotic wine fest and more an organized civic duty, albeit with costumes, parades, and theater competitions. People would line the streets in processions carrying phallic symbols, singing hymns to Dionysus, known as Dithyram's men, and boys wore ivy crowns, painted their faces, and chanted in unison. Satyrs, half-men, half-goat figures, would dance with abandon, symbolic of the thinning line between civilization and instinct. Perhaps the strangest part, all of this was sanctioned by the city-state, attended by politicians, and even partially funded by the government. In this ritualized disorder, ancient Greeks saw a form of cultural release, a socially approved safety valve. Dionysus, the god of not quite truths, allowed for a temporary inversion of norms. Yet these festivals were not just parties, they were spiritual. In a world where gods could be terrifying and fate could be cruel, Dionysus offered a kind of emotional honesty. To weep, to laugh, to stumble and dance, it was not weakness but participation in something divine. Maenads and the edge of the wilderness. Then there were the Maenads, or Bacchae, the female followers of Dionysus. Their stories, though often dramatized by later authors, capture the fear and fascination the Greeks held for this god's darker side. Maenads retreated from cities to the countryside, where they entered frenzied states of trance. Clad in fawnskins crowned with ivy, they roamed the woods, carrying thiosoy staffs tipped with pine cones. In myth, they could tear animals limb from limb with their bare hands during these rages, believing the god was present within them. One myth tells of Pentheus, the king of Thebes, who tried to spy on the He disguised himself as a woman and climbed a tree to observe their rites. But Dionysus, who always punished disbelief, led the Maenads to mistake Pentheus for a wild animal. They dragged him from the tree and tore him apart, piece by piece. The final blow was delivered by his own mother, Agave, who realized her mistake only after the madness passed. Though terrifying, such stories weren't cautionary in a modern moralistic sense. Rather, they reminded Greeks that the irrational, the emotional, and the ecstatic were not weaknesses to be suppressed but elements of the human experience to be acknowledged and respected. Dionysus and the theater, the calmest stage of madness. Dionysus gave the Greeks more than wild dances. He also gave them theater. Theater was born from the choral songs to Dionysus. Over time, these evolved into the great dramatic performances we still study today, those of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. Tragedy, in particular, was deeply done. Its themes, fate, madness, divine cruelty, human suffering echoed the lessons of the god. Every year, during the city Dionysia, 3 playwrights would each present 3 tragedies and 1 satyr play. These performances were not light-hearted entertainment. They were moral, emotional, and communal. Audiences wept together, reflected together. They confronted their deepest fears and frailties, and they did so under Dionysus' watchful eye. In a sense, the theater was a modern version of the forest clearing where Maenads danced. It was a structured madness, the chaos of emotion placed within the bounds of a script. of a stage, the Roman takeover, from Bacchus to bureaucracy. As Rome rose, so too did its own version of Dionysus, Bacchus. Yet the Romans, ever more suspicious of unregulated emotion, didn't quite know what to do with him. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate issued the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, a decree restricting the Bacchic cult. Officials feared the secret meetings, the apparent orgies, the blurring of class and gender boundaries. The wild joy of Dionysus, so essential to the Greeks, was too unpredictable for Rome's expanding bureaucracy. In time, Dionysus became more art than actuality. Statues, poetry, and ornate mosaics kept his memory alive, but the fervor, the raw, ecstatic belief faded. He became the god of vineyards and theater masks, still worshipped but tamed. A fading god in a changing world. By the late Roman Empire, as Christianity spread, Dionysus had little room left in the temples of belief. The ecstatic mysteries gave way to new liturgies. The vine became the symbol of another god. Yet Dionysus never fully disappeared. His legacy remains in the structure of tragedy, in the emotional freedom celebrated by artists, in the metaphors of madness and ecstasy. When Shakespeare wrote his Fools and Madmen, when modern philosophers mused on Dionysian versus Apollonian drives, the odd party planner of the ancient world danced on. Even now you may have felt him in the swelling joy of music, in the release of a good cry, in the hush of a theater when a play ends. Dionysus taught the ancients that within chaos there was divinity. Final thoughts. Was Dionysus a god of joy or a god of warning? And so, the story of Dionysus ends not with a grand revelation but with a quiet disappearance. Was he a symbol of liberation or a warning about losing control? Did the Greeks worship him to embrace their emotions, or to contain them? Maybe Dionysus wasn't about the answers. Maybe he was the question itself. What do we become when we stop pretending we're always in control? That's something to ponder. As the torches dim, the music fades, and even the gods themselves fall silent. Story 4. The Curious Case of the Spartan Mess Halls. Black broth and brotherhood. Daily life at the Spartan Societia. You probably know the Spartans as fearsome warriors. Their bronze helmets, crimson cloaks, and spears raised in unison have become symbols of ancient military discipline. But, beyond the battlefield, there was another world, one less flashy, but just as integral to what it meant to be Spartan. A world of soup, silence, and shared spoons. This was the Syssitia, the communal mess hall at the heart of Spartan daily life. You see, for Spartans, eating wasn't a private or domestic activity, it was a civic duty. From the age of 7, every male Spartan, or Spartiates, as the elite citizens were called, ate his meals not at home, but with his comrades in a military-style mess group. Not just during wartime, but every single day of his adult life. Meals were regular, rigid, and oddly symbolic. You were not allowed to eat at home with your family, not even once in a while. Doing so was considered un-Spartan, weak, and individualistic. Eating with your peers reinforced equality, discipline, and, above all, the values of the Spartan state. But what exactly did they eat? Let's start with malas, zomos, literally, black broth. This was the signature dish of the Spartan mess. It was so notorious throughout Greece that outsiders would come to Sparta just to see or taste the mysterious soup for themselves. Ingredients were simple: pork boiled in blood, seasoned with vinegar and salt. That's it. Now it may sound medieval, and it is, but there was logic behind it. The vinegar prevented the blood from clotting, the salt helped preserve it, and the pork offered a basic source of protein. It wasn't delicious, even the ancient writers joked about it, but it was practical, economical, and brutally in line with Spartan values: survival over luxury, nourishment over pleasure. According to one tale, a visiting Sybarite from the famously indulgent Greek city of Sybaris tried the black broth and immediately spat it out. "No wonder Spartans do not fear death," he said. "It is better than having to eat this again." But for Spartans, this soup was not just sustenance. It was a ritual, a badge of toughness. To enjoy it meant to accept Spartan values. To reject it was to signal that you didn't belong. And that mattered because belonging to the mess hall was a matter of citizenship. You couldn't be a full Spartan citizen without being accepted into a syssitia. This wasn't automatic. Each young man had to be voted in unanimously by the current members of a mess group. Just one black ball, one no vote could block your membership. It was a quiet, yet powerful form of social control. Once accepted, each man had to contribute monthly to the mess fund. That meant supplying barley, wine, cheese, and figs, plus money to help buy the pork for the broth. If you couldn't afford your share, you lost your place and possibly even your citizen rights. In a strange way, the mess hall reinforced both democracy and economic exclusion at the same time. Conversation at the mess tables was strict. Spartans were trained to speak in short, cutting sentences. The famous laconic style, brief, blunt, and sometimes biting, was born from these very tables. It wasn't a place for gossip or emotion. Every word had to count. Jokes were allowed, but only the dry kind, the type that sharpened the tongue like a whetstone on a blade. Yet for all its severity, the mess hall created something important. Solidarity, a sense of shared struggle. The man next to you wasn't just a fellow diner. He was your comrade, your shield-bearer, your other half in the phalanx. Eating together every day for years, from adolescence to old age, bonded men in a way that mere drills could not. This system also worked to flatten status. In the successor you sat side by side with others, regardless of family, wealth, or reputation. Your worth was measured not by your pedigree, but by your character. Could you endure the same meals, contribute equally, hold your tongue, and face the same dangers as the rest? Still, the system had limits. Not everyone in Sparta enjoyed this privilege. Women were excluded, of course, as were helots, the enslaved population that did most of the actual farming. Nor did Pyrrhoko free but non-citizen inhabitants get a seat at the table. In that way, the mess hall was a mirror of Spartan society, unified, disciplined, and fiercely exclusive. Interestingly, some archaeological studies suggest that Spartan dining areas may have been open-air or semi-permanent. No grand halls or temples, just simple benches, fire pits, and perhaps a roof for shade. No one in Sparta was meant to eat in luxury, even kings, and Sparta had 2 of them at a time, dined at the Sycessia. Their meals were only marginally better, and even then, only if the state allowed it. The mess hall also served as a loci council. Ideas were exchanged. Battles were recounted. Sons and nephews were judged quietly by the elders. Wounds were shown and respected, all without hierarchy or pomp. In many ways, the Sycessia replaced the hearth of the family home with the hearth of the state, and when war came, as it often did the same, men who shared broth in peace shared rations in battle. The bond of the mess group extended into the phalanx. If one man fell, the others fought harder. Loyalty wasn't just political or patriotic, it was personal. Yet as with many things Spartan, the mess system couldn't last forever. By the 4th century BC, wealth inequality was rising, and fewer men could afford their dues. As citizenship became tied to land ownership and income, number of full citizens and thus mess members began to shrink. Reforms were proposed. Some failed. Some never made it past debate. Eventually, the communal life of Sparta faded, replaced by something more fragmented, more ordinary. But for centuries, the humble Spartan mess, with its unappetizing broth and unyielding rules, shaped one of history's most formidable societies. And so, as you imagine the quiet clink of wooden spoons, the murmur of minimal conversation, and the flicker of torchlight on stone walls, consider this. What was it about sharing a simple meal day after day, year after year, that forged such unshakable unity? The cult of the vine. The reputation of Dionysus as a deity of wine, festivity, and madness didn't form overnight. It was shaped over centuries, drawn not just from stories of his divine escapades, but from the deliberate, often peculiar rituals performed in his name. These rituals, some of them rhythmic and hypnotic, others bordering on the chaotic, sprang from the desire of ordinary people to connect with something primal, sacred, and inexplicably transformative. Dionysus was, after all, a god who blurred boundaries between God and man, sanity and frenzy, civilization and wilderness. As the cult of Dionysus spread across the ancient Greek world, especially from the 7th century BCE onward, it didn't take the traditional path of temples and solemn hymns like those of Apollo or Athena. Instead, it thrived in the hills, forests, and temporary wooden theaters. The god's followers believed the natural world was his domain, and that the rituals honoring him were meant to evoke his dual nature, liberating yet terrifying, joyful yet dark. One of the most recognizable elements of Dionysian worship was the Thiasos, a traveling band of worshippers, often comprised mostly of women known as Maenads, who roamed into the countryside. They would dress in animal skins, crown their heads with ivy, carry the thyrsus, a fennel staff wrapped in vines and topped with a pine cone, and perform dances deep into the night. The dances were neither polished nor choreographed in the traditional sense. They were frenzied, meant to induce a trance-like state, sometimes through repetition, sometimes through rhythm, and often with the help of wine. These rituals served a deeper purpose than they may seem at first glance. To outsiders, the Maenads looked possessed, even dangerous. In some myths, they were described as capable of tearing animals or even humans apart in fits of divine madness, a state known as entheos, literally having a god within. But for the participants, these rituals offered release from daily life, from social constraints, from the ever-tightening expectations of order that governed ancient Greek city life. That it's also worth noting that Dionysus was one of the few gods worshipped by people across all social classes. While many temples were dominated by the elite or controlled by state-sponsored rituals, Dionysian festivals brought together slaves, women, foreigners, and the working poor people typically excluded from religious life. These gatherings allowed for a temporary inversion of societal norms. The lowly could speak freely, the masked could be anyone, and for a night or two, under torchlight and song, the rules of the polis melted away in the wine-sweet air. But of course, this didn't sit well with everyone. The philosopher Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, voiced deep discomfort with Dionysian excesses. In his ideal city, described in the Republic, he envisioned strict controls over music, poetry, and emotional expression. Anything that stirred the soul too much, be it a tragic chorus or a night of ecstatic dancing, was to be curtailed. It is not hard to imagine that, to someone like Plato, the cult of Dionysus was a threat, not just to reason but to the fragile order upon which cities rested. Yet the rituals of Dionysus were not simply chaotic. They were carefully timed and seasonally significant. One of the most important festivals dedicated to the god was the Anthesteria, held in Athens over 3 days in the early spring. It marked the opening of the year's new wine, but it also served as a strange communion with the dead. On the second day, known as Chos, meaning the cups, families drank quietly and separately in their homes, with some setting out cups for spirits of the dead who were believed to roam the city. Dionysus, being a god of boundaries, was thought to mediate between the living and the dead, between joy and sorrow, presence and absence. The Great Dionysia was another such celebration, a grand festival that evolved into a cornerstone of Athenian cultural life. It was here, amid performances of tragic and comic plays, that playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes competed. These plays were not light entertainment, they were reflections of human suffering, political tensions, and divine caprice. That these performances were held in Dionysus's honor is telling. He was the god of masks, of transformation, of stories that danced between the absurd and the tragic. Indeed, the Greek theater itself is a legacy of Dionysian worship. The very concept of drama actors donning masks, taking on roles, stepping into other lives grew out of rituals in which worshippers imitated Dionysus's mythic journey, his suffering, his triumph, and his chaos. The Greek word for actor, hypokrites, literally means answerer or interpreter, a nod to those who communicated with, or even channeled, the divine through performance. But just as Dionysus brought transformation to his worshippers, he also changed depending on where and how he was worshipped. In Thebes, he was the native sun denied his place among the gods. In Delphi, he was a seasonal god who ruled the oracle during the winter months, while Apollo, the god of order, withdrew. In Thrace he was wild and unbound. In Eleuthery he arrived as a stranger whose journey sparked the foundation of the theater. Perhaps one of the strangest yet most telling details of Dionysian worship is how often it involved reversal of expectations, of identity, of the ordinary. Men dressed as women, the noble mingled with slaves, logic bowed to emotion. The theater stage, with its painted backdrops and dramatic gestures, wasn't just a place for amusement, it was a sacred mirror in which Athenians examined themselves. Dionysus wasn't just the party god, he was the god who held up that mirror and asked, "Who are you beneath your name and mask?" In this way, his cult allowed for a kind of introspection rarely found elsewhere in ancient religion. Through song, wine, and ritual madness, the Greeks weren't escaping reality, they were confronting it, transformed. But one question still lingers. If Dionysus was the god of joyful release and transformative ritual, why did so many fear him? Perhaps the answer lies in the stories still to come. Wine, wrath, and a god remembered. You've wandered through Dionysus's birth, his education among mountain nymphs, his strange, leafy travels, and his troubling encounters, but the god's odyssey was far from over. In this final section, we follow him home to Greece, to Olympus, and into the very heart of the Greek imagination, where grapes fermented into wine, ceremonies took root, and madness lurked behind masks. and laughter. Let's begin with a return that was anything but triumphant. A god comes home and nobody notices when Dionysus finally stepped onto the shores of mainland Greece. His arrival was anticlimactic, unlike Athena who burst fully formed from Zeus's head, or Apollo who rode his chariot into Delphi. Dionysus was met with suspicion. A young man in ivy, with women in tow, wine on his breath, and chaos in his wake. He looked less like a god and more like a traveling actor or a dangerous vagrant. His first stop was Thebes, a city known more for tragedy than hospitality. Thebes was ruled by Pentheus, a tidy-minded, duty-bound king who found Dionysus and everything he stood for entirely objectionable. Wine, dancing, feminine ecstasy, madness in the countryside. No, thank you. Pentheus banned Dionysian worship. He forbade the Bacchae female followers of Dionysus from gathering on the mountainsides. He tried to have the god arrested, which, of course, went poorly. After all, trying to chain down a being made of mist and myth is a fool's errand, and Pentheus was a fool by mythological standards. The king who played dress-up Dionysus, ever theatrical, didn't punish Pentheus with thunder or spears. No, he used something much more effective. Curiosity. He whispered to the king that the Bacchae were performing unspeakable rites outside the city. If he wanted to understand the threat, really understand it, he would need to go undercover. Pentheus, dressed as a woman, donning flowing robes and a wig, he tiptoed into the mountains, hoping to spy on the frenzied women. Dionysus led him up a tree for a better view, but the god had also stirred the minds of the Bacchae into a divine frenzy. To them, Pentheus wasn't a king, he was a wild animal, a threat, a creature of prey. And so, the story ends in grisly tragedy. Pentheus was torn apart by the women. His own mother, Agave, leading the charge, her mind clouded by the madness of Dionysus. What does madness mean, anyway? This tale may seem like pure cruelty, but beneath it is a warning, or perhaps, a reflection. The Greeks feared too much order just as much as they feared chaos. Pentheus tried to suppress the irrational, the wild, the emotional, the very things Dionysus embodied, and in trying to deny that side of human nature, he became its victim. Dionysus wasn't just the god of drinking, he was the god of letting go, of transformation, of losing oneself, whether in wine, in theater, in love, or in religious ecstasy. To worship Dionysus wasn't simply to party, it was to accept that not all of life could be planned or controlled. There were forces within and without that demanded surrender, from man to myth to Mount Olympus. Despite such dark beginnings, Dionysus's cult grew. His worship spread through Greece like vine tendrils, wrapping around cities, reaching into every corner of society. Festivals called Dionysia were held in his honor, some raucous, some formal. In Athens, the city of logic and law, Dionysia became a cornerstone of civic life. And here's where things get even stranger. From Dionysus's rituals sprang Greek theater. Actors wore masks to imitate his divine power of transformation. Tragedies and comedies were staged in his honor. People came not just to laugh or cry, but to commune with something greater, something emotional, something cathartic. But without Dionysus, there might be no drama, no literature, no catharsis, just speeches and rules and laws, all order. No ecstasy. Wine, and what it meant, of course. We cannot ignore the wine. Dionysus's greatest gift and greatest temptation was not the drink itself, but what it did. Loosened tongues, lowered inhibitions, turned pain into poetry. To the Greeks, wine was both medicine and madness. It was used in ceremonies, in parties, in grief. To pour a libation was to honor the gods. To get drunk, that was closer to meeting them. Vineyards became sacred ground. Grape harvests were tied to festivals. The cycle of fermentation was viewed as divine alchemy, the transformation of sunlight and soil into a substance that could warm your chest and blow your thoughts. And always Dionysus was there, sometimes in the cup, sometimes in the laughter, sometimes in the dance that no one remembered starting, the twice-born god and the afterlife. Here's a curious fact. Dionysus, despite his wild reputation, was also a god of resurrection. Remember, he had died and returned as an infant, but some myths say he descended into the underworld to find his mother Semele and brought her back. In doing so, he defied death not through strength, but through love. He became a bridge between worlds, the living and the dead, the ordered and the chaotic, the rational and the ecstatic. That's why in some versions of Greek belief, mystery, cults, especially the Orphic ones centered around Dionysus, to follow him was to embrace death not as an end, but as transformation. These rituals weren't written down, they were secret. passed in whispers and shadows. Initiates fasted, chanted, consumed wine, perhaps reenacted his myths. What they sought was not knowledge, but experience, an understanding felt in the bones, not spoken in words. Dionysus in Rome and beyond. When the Romans adopted Greek gods, they renamed Dionysus Bacchus. His cult grew even larger and wilder. The Bacchanalia, as the Romans called his festivals, became infamous. So much so that in 186 BCE, the Roman Senate passed laws restricting them. The celebrations were too chaotic, too emotional, too uncontrolled for the stern Roman soul. But Bacchus endured. He appears in medieval manuscripts, in Renaissance paintings, in poetry and opera. Always half-naked, always surrounded by grapes and laughter and longing, he became a symbol not just of wine, but of the part of us that resists being tamed. What remains today in modern times? Dionysus lingers less in temples, more in metaphors. There in the actor who loses herself in a role, in the friend who laughs too loudly at a party, in the poet who writes through heartbreak, in the festival where strangers dance barefoot in the grass. He's in the first sip of wine. After a hard day, he's in the moment when emotion overwhelms logic and something beautiful or terrible happens. And he's in the theater, where masks are worn not to hide, but to reveal deeper truths. Dionysus was many things: a foreigner, a troublemaker, a healer, a danger, a lover, a madman, a god. But above all, he was a reminder that we are not only creatures of reason, but we are dreamers, dancers, feelers, and fools. And perhaps in remembering him, we remember that life is not only meant to be understood, but also, sometimes, to be felt, lost in, and simply survived. Now, as the firelight dims and the wine dries on the rim of the cup, we are left with one last question. In a world that demands order, where do you let your wildness live? Story 5. The Olive Tree and the Sea God. The boring battle for Athens. When the gods chose a city, you're lying there, eyes slowly blinking, your body growing still, and your thoughts drifting like old parchment caught in a breeze. Let's take a quiet step into ancient Greece, not to the heart of battle or the height of drama, but into a curious contest, the kind that wouldn't make headlines, but subtly shaped the soul of a city that still whispers to us through ruins and museums. Before Athens became Athens, before the Parthenon perched proudly on its Acropolis, and long before democracy marched its ideas across history, there was simply a rocky land by the sea, waiting to be claimed. The gods of Olympus, not yet enshrined in myths or temples, watched with a certain interest, and two of them, Poseidon and Athena, set their eyes on this patch of earth, both desiring the honor of being its patron. It's worth noting that such squabbles between gods were not uncommon in Greek myths, but this one was oddly civil, almost disappointingly so. It wasn't settled with thunderbolts or epic duels, but rather through a public demonstration, a kind of divine audition in front of mortal witnesses. No drama, just ... presentations. Poseidon, the powerful sea god, was used to command and fear. His trident could shake the earth and stir the oceans. He approached the rocky hill with all the swagger of a god used to awe. Striking the ground with his trident, he created a saltwater spring, or, in some versions, a horse sprang from the rock. The details vary, but the outcome was the same, a show of raw aquatic power. The water, however, was salty and undrinkable, impressive, but not entirely useful for everyday life. Then came Athena, quiet, reserved. Wise Athena was not one for theatrical flourishes. She approached the same ground, knelt down, and planted something far less glamorous than a fountain or a galloping steed. She planted a tree, an olive tree, to be exact. Its leaves shimmered in the sun. The fruit was bitter if eaten raw, but when pressed, it produced oil useful for cooking, lighting lamps, soothing wounds, and anointing the skin. It was a gift not of awe but of practicality, a boring gift, you might say, but it would prove to be the one that endured. The mortals watched both presentations carefully. There was no cheering crowd or divine thunder, just the quiet assessment of farmers, herders, and traders. They saw the olive tree not just as a plant, but as a promise of food, trade, peace, and industry. And so they made their choice. Athena won. It wasn't a victory of strength or spectacle, but of utility. Of all the cities she could have claimed, this one chose the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and craft. Poseidon, never one to take rejection gracefully, reportedly flooded part of the region in anger, but the people stood by their choice, and the city became Athens, named not for power or storm, but for a tree and a goddess who thought before she acted. And so the olive tree remained. growing quietly through the centuries. You can still find its descendants on the Acropolis today, gnarled and weathered. Tourists pass by, snapping photos, perhaps unaware they are walking beneath a legacy chosen not in battle, but in a moment of subtle brilliance. Yet one must ask, why did Poseidon offer water in a land that needed sustenance? Did he misunderstand the people, or did he simply believe that spectacle would win over substance? And what of Athena? Did she know, with certainty, that her gift would speak to their needs more deeply? You can almost imagine the silence of that moment, wind rustling olive leaves, the smell of sea spray in the distance, the onlookers weighing their future in the quiet air. What would you have chosen? Roots of power and the growth of a city? After the gods' quiet contest was decided, and Athena's olive tree was chosen as the symbol and protector of the new city, the tale might seem like it simply ended there with a single, practical gift prevailing over a flashy but less useful one. But, as with much of ancient history and mythology, the story of the olive tree in Athens is far more involved, layered with social, economic, and even political realities that stretched far beyond the olive's first roots in the rocky soil. Olive tree, more than a symbol. At first glance, an olive tree may seem dull compared to the thunderous power of Poseidon's sea or the thunderbolt of Zeus, yet the olive tree was a cornerstone of life for ancient Athenians. The olive's importance was practical. Olive oil was used for cooking, for lighting lamps, and even for medicinal purposes. It lubricated gears in some of the earliest machinery, and it was a key product for trade. The trade of olive oil linked Athens to cities and ports across the Mediterranean, weaving the city into a wider economic network. From this trade, Athens grew wealthy and influential, its citizens able to invest in culture, defense, and infrastructure. But the olive was also a sacred symbol, a gift from Athena herself representing peace and prosperity. The olive wreath, or katinos, became the prize for victors in the ancient Olympic Games, symbolizing honor and victory without bloodshed. Athens' connection to the olive tree extended beyond economics and symbolism. It became a powerful political and religious emblem. The sacred olive groves around the city were carefully guarded and treated with reverence, serving as places for quiet reflection, prayer, and ceremony. Poseidon's saltwater and the sea's role. Poseidon, angry and disappointed, was not simply spurned without consequences. His gift saltwater was less appreciated by the early Athenians, but it was no less vital. The sea was Athens' gateway to the world. Athens' famed port of Piraeus would eventually become a hub for ships laden with goods, soldiers, and ideas. Poseidon was the god of the sea, storms, horses, and earthquakes, a powerful, sometimes unpredictable force. His domain was vast, extending far beyond Athens, while his direct influence over the city was limited. His power over the waters that surrounded it was absolute. The sea was both a lifeline and a threat. Storms could wreck ships and drown sailors, but the sea also brought fish and trade. It connected Athens with the wider Greek world and beyond, enabling Athens to build an empire of commerce and naval power in many ways. Poseidon's gift, though initially rejected, became central to Athens' identity. His anger was manifest in earthquakes that shook the land and in storms that tested the city's resilience. The tension between the stability promised by Athena's olive and the chaos symbolized by Poseidon's sea would echo in Athens' history for centuries. The politics of divine patronage. The story of the contest is not just a myth but a reflection of political realities in ancient Athens. The choice of Athena as the city's patron goddess reflected the values that Athens wanted to promote: wisdom, strategy, craft, and order. This choice aligned with the city's emerging identity as a center of philosophy, democracy, and art. Athena was often portrayed as a virgin goddess, embodying rationality and protection without passion or excess. Her olive tree, with its slow growth and steady yield, was a metaphor for sustainable prosperity. Poseidon, by contrast, represented raw power and unpredictability. His association with horses and earthquakes linked him to war and natural disaster. In the political landscape of ancient Athens, emphasizing Athena's qualities over Poseidon's was a deliberate choice, a way for leaders to signal the city's commitment to civilization, law, and intellect over brute force. Olive oil and economy, the backbone of Athens. Olive oil was not merely a cooking ingredient, it was a product that fueled Athens' economy. Farmers cultivated olives on the hillsides, harvesting fruit that was pressed into oil. This oil was stored in amphorae and shipped throughout the Mediterranean. The trade routes connected Athens to Egypt, Italy, Spain, and North Africa. The revenues from olive oil exports helped finance the city's navy, which was critical for Athens' dominance in the 5th century BCE. It was the Athenian fleet that played a decisive role in the Persian Wars, protecting Greece from invasion. The city's wealth also funded monumental architecture, like the Parthenon, built to honor Athena herself, religious rituals, and the sacred olive. Athenians believed that the olive tree was a gift directly from Athena, which made it sacred. They held festivals to honor the goddess, like the Panathenaea, an annual event celebrating Athena's birthday. During these festivals, a new robe, the peplus, was woven and presented to the statue of Athena. Olive branches and oil played a central role in the ceremonies, symbolizing renewal and blessing. Priests and priestesses guarded the sacred olive groves. Cutting down an olive tree was considered a grave offense, punishable by severe penalties. The lasting legacy of a boring gift. So, why does this story feel so quiet compared to the thunderous deeds of gods and heroes? Because the olive tree teaches a different kind of lesson, one of patience, persistence, and the quiet power of steady growth. Athens did not become great through sudden explosions of force or flashy miracles, but through steady investment in culture, economy, and community. The olive tree stood as a living reminder that sometimes the most boring gifts, those that nourish and sustain, are the most valuable. The question left hanging. The contest between Athena and Poseidon left Athens with two gifts, each representing a path: the ordered, prudent, and sustainable life, symbolized by the olive tree, and the wild, powerful, and unpredictable life, symbolized by the sea. Which gift shaped Athens most? And how did the tension between these two forces influence the city's rise and fall? As you lie quietly, thinking of olive branches and the endless sea, consider this: in a world of storms and calm, chaos and order, which do you think ultimately holds sway? Between olive branches and ocean waves, Athens' fate and the divine legacy. After the gods' contest settled and Athena's olive tree was chosen as the city's protector, Athens grew and transformed under the gaze of its divine patron. But the relationship between olive and sea, order and chaos, peace and power, did not end with that quiet decision. Instead, it shaped the city's character, its ambitions, and even its downfalls. This final section explores how the olive tree's legacy intertwined with the sea's enduring influence, and what Athens' story reveals about human resilience, values, and the complex dance between stability and change. The olive tree as the city's quiet foundation. Athena's gift was far from a one-time event. The olive tree became a symbol woven through the very fabric of Athenian life. Olive oil, the city's liquid gold, lubricated not just lamps and machinery, but also the wheels of the economy and governance. It funded the navy that protected trade routes and expanded Athens' influence across the Mediterranean. But more than money or power, the olive represented values. It was a reminder that prosperity was to be cultivated patiently, steadily, a slow ripening fruit rather than a sudden burst of glory. Poseidon Sea, the uncontrollable partner. Poseidon did not vanish from the city's story after his loss. In the contest, his domain, the sea, remained vital to Athens' survival and expansion. The harbor of Piraeus, connected to the city by long walls, became the beating heart of Athens' naval power. Through it came grain from Egypt and Sicily, timber from the Black Sea, and traders from all over the ancient world. Yet the sea was unpredictable. Storms could wreck fleets, pirates prowled the waters, and naval warfare was a constant reality. This meant Athens had to balance Athena's gift of the olive with Poseidon's gift, sometimes a curse of the sea. The city's success depended on both order and adaptability, on steady growth and readiness for sudden change. Political and social reflections of divine gifts. The choice of Athena over Poseidon was not just mythological, it reflected Athenian society's ideals. Athens developed the world's first democracy, a system based on law, debate, and collective governance. Athena's symbolism as a goddess of wisdom and craft aligned with this political experiment. Yet democracy was not simple order. It was vibrant, at times chaotic, full of debate and disagreement. The unpredictable energy of Poseidon's sea lingered in the city's politics and in the tensions between rulers and ruled, oligarchs and commoners. This dynamic tension kept Athens alive, sometimes unstable, but always striving. The olive tree in art and architecture. The olive motif appears in countless artworks and structures throughout Athens. Most famously, the Parthenon itself, built in the 5th century BCE, the Acropolis honored Athena. The temples, sculptures, and friezes depicted her victories, including the contest with Poseidon. Inside the Parthenon was a massive statue of Athena, holding a small olive tree, a symbol of peace and prosperity. This combination of artistry and faith reinforced the olive's place as the city's guardian. Athena's olive and the Olympic Games. The olive wreath, or katinos awarded to Olympic victors, was not only a prize but a symbol of honor tied directly to Athena's gift. Athletes competing in ancient Greece fought not just for glory but for connection to the divine order represented by the olive. Practice highlights how a seemingly boring tree became central to ancient concepts of achievement, excellence, and respect. The duality of stability and change. Athens' history can be seen as a balance between the steady growth symbolized by the olive and the restless energy of the sea. Its golden age, the 5th century BCE, the era of Pericles, was built on naval supremacy and cultural flourishing, fueled by both economic stability and expansionist ambition. Yet this success sowed the seeds of conflict. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta, itself a city-state with a different set of values, tested Athens' resilience. Wars, plagues, and political upheavals rocked the city, much like storms rocking ships at sea. What did the ancient Athenians think? Ancient writers often used the olive and the sea metaphorically in Aeschylus' tragedies. For example, the tension between order and chaos, fate and free will, echoes the tension between Athena and Poseidon's gifts. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle pondered the balance between reason and passion, stability and change, much like the city itself embodied modern echoes of the olive and the sea. Today, the olive tree remains a symbol of peace and endurance throughout the Mediterranean. Athens, now a sprawling modern city, still carries the imprint of its mythic origins. Olive trees grow in parks and courtyards. The sea remains central to life and culture. The story of Athena and Poseidon reminds us of the importance of balancing different forces in life: practicality and power. Calm and storm, wisdom and passion. The quiet power of the boring gift. You drift closer to sleep. Think about this. Athens did not conquer the world through lightning bolts or grandiose magic. It built itself on something far less dramatic: the slow, persistent growth of an olive tree, the daily labor of farmers and merchants, the steady lighting of lamps and filling of amphorae. Sometimes, the most boring things, a tree, a drop of oil, a small decision, shape history more profoundly than battles or heroes. The final question the gods offered Athens two choices: the wild, unpredictable sea, and the steady, life-giving olive. The city chose the olive, but the sea remained forever near, restless and powerful. Which would you choose, if you could? And what does your choice say about how you live your life between calm and storm, certainty and change? Story 6. The endless labors of Heracles when boring tasks became legendary, the beginning of a hero's tedious trials. Heracles, the name might bring to mind epic feats, monstrous battles, and divine wrath. But beneath the roar of lions and the clash of titans lies a surprisingly dull story of punishment, labor, and sheer endurance. It is a story that begins not with glory, but with humiliation and the kind of tedious work that would exhaust even the most patient among us. Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, Alcmene. From his very birth, his life was marked by struggle. Hera, Zeus's wife, hated him for being a constant reminder of her husband's infidelity. She sought to destroy him at every turn, sending snakes to kill the infant Heracles and later driving him into madness. It was this madness that led to the beginning of his 12 labors, the seemingly endless list of chores assigned to him by King Eurystheus. These labors were no grand adventures at first glance. They were more like tedious tasks assigned as punishment and cleansing. Each labor was difficult, certainly, but not always glamorous. The story of Heracles' labors is, in many ways, the story of persistence, how ordinary, boring, and sometimes grotesque work can shape a legend. And it all began with a simple request: to rid the world of 12 impossible problems. One by one, the long road through monsters and men. When you think of Heracles, the image that often comes to mind is that of a mighty figure wrestling lions, or battling giants. But behind each of those famous feats lies a series of arduous, often mundane tasks that tested his endurance, patience, and resilience more than his raw strength. The 12 labors were not a simple checklist of heroic moments. They were grueling ordeals stretching over years, marked by long journeys, unexpected failures, and moments of quiet reflection rarely captured in the flashier versions of the myths. The beginning, the Nemean lion. The first labor was to kill the Nemean lion, a beast with impenetrable skin that terrorized the countryside. Heracles quickly learned that brute force alone would not win the day. After his arrows failed to pierce the lion's hide, he was forced to wrestle the creature barehanded, eventually strangling it to death. While this might sound thrilling, imagine the physical toll: days tracking a large predator, the effort of grappling a creature as strong as himself, and the necessity of figuring out how to skin it afterward without sharp tools. Heracles used the lion's own claws to skin it, creating a cloak that would become his signature garment, the Lernaean Hydra. Multiplying problems. Next came the Hydra, a serpent with multiple heads. Cut off one, and two would grow back. This labor was less about strength and more about strategy. Heracles soon realized that fighting the Hydra required more than muscle. It demanded cleverness. He enlisted the help of his nephew Laus, who used fire to cauterize the necks after Heracles severed each head, preventing them from regenerating. Yet this victory was also bittersweet. One head was immortal, requiring Heracles to bury it under a heavy rock. The labor stretched over weeks, testing his patience and persistence, the boring and the brutal. Following these two, Heracles' tasks became a mixture of the tedious and the terrifying. He was ordered to capture the Cyrenian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis, known for its incredible speed and elusive nature. Rather than slaying it, he had to catch it alive, a task requiring patience and gentle handling, a strange change from his usual displays of brute force. Similarly, he had to clean the Augean stables in a single day, a task so menial that it has become proverbial for impossible chores. The stables housed thousands of cattle and had not been cleaned in decades. Heracles tackled this by rerouting rivers to wash out the filth, demonstrating ingenuity as much as strength. Capturing the golden hind and the Erymanthian boar. The capture of the golden hind took months. Heracles had to track the deer for miles, respecting its sacred status, never harming it. This labor shows a side of the hero often overlooked: his ability to adapt, to wait, and to persist without violence. The Erymanthian boar was another beast that required careful handling. Unlike the lion or hydra, this boar was wild but real, and Heracles had to chase it through snow and forest, finally trapping it alive. This labor, while less glamorous than slaying monsters, was exhausting, tracking a wild animal through harsh terrain, waiting for the right moment to act. The Stymphalian birds and the Cretan bull. Heracles' labors also included clearing a swamp filled with man-eating birds with metal feathers. The task was dangerous, but not quick. Heracles used a rattle given by Athena to startle the birds into flight, then shot them down. It was a test of endurance and marksmanship rather than strength. He also captured the Cretan bull, a wild beast wreaking havoc on Crete. The bull had to be wrestled and restrained, then brought back alive. The process took days, and involved careful handling to avoid injury. The mares of Diomedes and the girdle of Hippolyta, among the more gruesome labors, were capturing the man-eating mares of King Diomedes and retrieving the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The mares required Heracles to capture them and tame them, a terrifying prospect given their ferocity. The labor also had political undertones, as it involved invading the lands of King Diomedes. The girdle labor involved negotiations and battles with the warrior women. Heracles initially received the girdle peacefully, but Hera's interference led to conflict. This labor highlighted the complexities of diplomacy and deception rather than mere physical conquest. The cattle of Geryon and the apples of the Hesperides. Later labors took Heracles to the edges of the known world. He was tasked with stealing the cattle of the three-bodied giant Geryon, an arduous journey that involved crossing deserts and battling guards. The final labor involved retrieving golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides, guarded by a dragon, and the nymphs themselves. This task was more about negotiation and persistence than combat, requiring Heracles to enlist the help of Atlas to retrieve the apples. Lessons from the labors: endurance over glory. Throughout these 12 tasks, Heracles' greatest tool was not his strength, but his endurance and willingness to face endless, sometimes boring, challenges. The labors forced him into roles not always befitting the traditional image of a hero. He had to think, wait, negotiate, and endure discomfort. Many tasks were less about defeating monsters and more about solving problems, often through ingenuity or sheer persistence. What do the labors teach us? The story of Heracles' labors reminds us that true heroism often lies in tackling the tedious, the repetitive, and the seemingly boring. Strength is important, yes, but patience, strategy, and resilience shape legends just as much. and the fact that these stories have survived for millennia, passed down through generations, suggests that ancient audiences understood this too. The labors were not just myths of monsters, but lessons in human endurance and the messy work of life. The legacy that danced through time. You are walking through an overgrown path, perhaps in an olive grove long since abandoned. The leaves whisper in a breeze, and the sun begins to dip. In your mind, the sounds of distant pipes seem to rise. The echo of ancient music that once filled these lands during festivals long forgotten. The final act of Dionysus's story unfolds slowly, not in thunder or war, but in rituals and repetition. This perhaps is his true legacy, not just in the myths, but in the rhythms that beat quietly beneath the surface of Greek society for centuries. By the time the classical period of Greece took shape, Dionysus was no longer just a shadowy foreigner or a suspicious rural deity. He had become something else entirely, something woven into the fabric of cities, politics, and performance. His strange rites, once confined to hillsides and secret woods, were now taking center stage literally. One of the most enduring legacies of Dionysus is the birth of Greek theater, which grew directly out of the festivals held in his honor. Known as the city Dionysia, these festivals were formal affairs held in Athens and other major cities. The god of wine, madness, and ecstasy became the patron of stagecraft, drama, and poetic expression. It's an odd twist, isn't it? The same god who once inspired frenzied women to tear animals limb from limb was now inspiring playwrights to explore the boundaries of reason, emotion, and civic values. But how did a religious ceremony turn into something as refined and politically potent as tragedy? It began with a simple ritual, the dithyramb, a choral hymn sung in honor of Dionysus. These were not simple tunes, they were poetic, dramatic, and performed by large choruses. Over time, these hymns evolved. One member of the chorus began to step forward, interacting, breaking away, telling part of the story in dialogue rather than song. This role grew into the concept of the actor, and eventually, playwrights like Thespis, yes, that's where we get the word thespian, introduced characters, conflict, and themes. Dionysus festivals, therefore, were more than just wine-soaked days of indulgence. They were the incubators of Western drama and literature. The tragedies of Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus, with all their lofty themes of fate, justice, and human suffering, were performed in Dionysus's name. Imagine watching Oedipus Rex or the Bacchae in an open-air theater at the base of the Acropolis. Every actor, every scene, every word presented as both art and offering to the god of paradoxes. The irony, of course, is that Dionysus himself was a kind of eternal contradiction. His dual nature, joyous yet tragic, divine yet mortal, celebratory yet destructive, made him the perfect symbol for theater. He wasn't one thing, he was many. And that's exactly what the stage allowed people to explore. Every mask worn by an actor in a tragedy or comedy was, in its own way, a nod to Dionysus' ever-shifting face. Beyond the theater, Dionysus' cult continued to grow. Across the Mediterranean, his followers took his rituals with them. In Rome, he became known as Bacchus, and his rites were imported, though not without controversy. One of the more fascinating and alarming episodes in his post-Greek legacy was the Roman Senate's crackdown on the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE. The Bacchanalia were Dionysian festivals held in secret groves outside Rome. Initially small and occasional, they grew in size and frequency. Men and women both participated, something that made the conservative Roman elites deeply uncomfortable. Reports came in, orgies, conspiracies, murders. Whether these were real or exaggerated, the Roman Senate issued one of the most famous crackdowns. In its history, thousands of worshippers were arrested, temples were dismantled, participation in Bacchic rites became punishable by death unless done under strict state supervision. And yet, even then, the cult did not die. The god of wine and drama was not so easily silenced. If anything, he simply changed form. In private homes, in whispered prayers, and in dramatic festivals allowed under Roman rule, Dionysus lived on. Statues of him were placed in gardens. He appeared in mosaics with grapes in hand and ivy in his hair. The people still needed him. Why? Because he represented something deeply human, our longing to let go, to celebrate, to step outside the boundaries of reason and control. That, more than anything, might explain Dionysus' endurance. He wasn't the god of war, nor of wisdom or harvest. He was the god of altered states, of transformation. In wine, in dance, in drama, in grief and joy. He showed people a different way of being, sometimes dangerous, sometimes enlightening, always compelling. Even his myths reflect this. He died and was reborn over and over. In the Orphic tradition, he was torn apart by the Titans and reassembled by the gods, making him a symbol of resurrection. In the seasonal cycle of his festivals, his presence was lost and regained. In the theater, he was there in every character who wore a mask to become something else, if only for a few hours. By the Hellenistic period, Dionysus had transcended his early rustic image entirely. Now he was depicted as an androgynous, almost delicate figure. He was no longer just the boisterous country god of wine barrels and goat sacrifices. He had become the symbol of cultured pleasure, intellectual play, and the fragile boundary between sanity and madness. Statues of him adorned the homes of philosophers, generals, and emperors alike. Yet even in this refined form, his deeper essence remained. Dionysus was still the force that pulled at the edges of the ordinary. He whispered that life was more than duty and law, that beneath the robes and rituals of daily life, something wild and sacred still beat. In time, as Christianity spread through the empire, Dionysus faded from public life, but not entirely. Some early Christian writers couldn't help but note the similarities between Dionysian rites and their own ritual drinking of wine, notions of resurrection, communal gatherings. Of course, the church suppressed the Bacchic cults, but the echoes were never fully silenced. Today, when you sip wine with friends, when you attend a play, when you dance in joy or cry at a powerful story, you touch the realm of Dionysus, not in name, perhaps, but in essence. He was the god who allowed humans to feel the fullness of life, its sweetness and sadness, its order and chaos. He taught people to lose themselves, not to escape the world, but to understand it more deeply, to see through the mask, to feel, even just for a moment, that life was more than what could be measured or explained. And so, as we walk away from the story of Dionysus, it lingers not with a clash of thunder or a dramatic death, but with a quiet, persistent rhythm, like the beat of a distant drum, or the sound of feet moving through ivy leaves in some forgotten grove, or the hush before a play begins. What other forgotten gods shaped us in ways we no longer remember? And what other truths still dance just beyond the veil of our reason? Story 7. The Roman Roads. Nobody talks about the silent stones of empire. Building the bones of an empire. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of sandals on stone, quiet, rhythmic, and unchanging. For centuries, travelers across the Roman Empire walked the same roads, trod the same ruts, and leaned against the same mile markers, but few paused to think about how those roads got there in the first place, or who put them together stone by stone in the heat, the cold, and the dust. Let's go back to the beginning, not to the glories of Julius Caesar or the grandeur of the Colosseum, but to the damp soil of early Latium around the 4th century BCE. Here, amid rolling hills and primitive farming villages, Roman engineers began laying the groundwork, literally, for one of the greatest logistical achievements in human history. The very first of these roads, the Via Appia, was commissioned in 312 BCE by Appius Claudius Caecus. He wasn't building it for tourism or convenience, he was building it for war. The Romans needed to move troops quickly and efficiently to fight the Samnites in the south. Horses, chariots, soldiers, supplies, all needed a reliable path. But here's where it becomes interesting, not glorious, but slow, detailed, and deeply Roman. Constructing a Roman road wasn't glamorous, it was meticulous. First, they dug deep trenches, sometimes as deep as 3 feet, to create a stable foundation. This foundation, called the stamen, was filled with layers of stones. Over that came the rudus, a layer of compacted gravel mixed with lime, then a finer layer called the nucleus, and finally, large paving stones made of basalt or limestone. They even built drainage ditches along the sides, so rain wouldn't turn the road into a muddy trap. Some roads even had sidewalks and built-in rest stops, called mutations, for changing horses, and mansionese for overnight stays. No part of the design was random. Everything had a purpose, from the slope of the crown in the middle of the road, to the placement of the stones themselves. The result? Roads so strong that some are still in use today, 2,000 years later. But who built them? Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't Roman citizens doing the hard labor. Much of the work was done by slaves, soldiers, and local laborers, often conscripted or paid little. The soldiers saw it as part of their training and punishment. One Roman historian even noted that soldiers grew as much in discipline from wielding a pickaxe as they did from holding a spear. And then there was the surveying, the precise, Quiet calculations made with a tool called a groma used to mark straight lines across miles of terrain. Roman surveyors or agrimensors were obsessed with precision. They marked miles with stone columns known as milestones, milliaria, engraved with distances and the names of emperors who maintained the roads. These milestones stood silently, counting the passage of time with every footstep and every cartwheel. It wasn't just about moving armies. Over time, these roads became the capillaries of empire, carrying goods, tax money, messages, and news. They connected cities, ports, and military outposts from the wilds of Britannia to the sands of Syria. Still, life along the road was not glamorous. Way stations were often infested with vermin. Inns were loud and smoky. Traveling could be dangerous, not just from robbers or weather, but from the sheer exhaustion of moving across vast distances. A typical ox cart moved at about 2 miles per hour. A messenger on horseback with fresh horses might do 50 miles in a day, but for a regular merchant, it was a slow trudge, accompanied by dust, blisters, and boredom. Yet the roads did something astonishing. They gave shape to the Roman imagination. A citizen in Gaul could picture the streets of Rome because he could follow the road there, stone by stone. A tax collector in Judea could trace his payments back to the imperial capital not in abstraction, but by mileage. And like arteries, these roads also carried decline. As the empire aged and fractured, the roads fell into disrepair. Stones were stolen to build local homes or churches. Milestones were repurposed into altars. But even in ruin, the paths often remained. The towns that grew up along them, like Beneventum, Brundisium, or Augusta Treverium, owed their survival to the steady trickle of travel, trade, and time. What's often forgotten in grand tales of legions and emperors is this: empires walk on their roads. Without roads, Rome would have been a city-state with ambition. With them, it became the center of a world. But here's something to ponder as you drift into sleep. How did these roads affect the lives of the people who didn't march in legions, or read edicts from Caesar, those who merely lived beside them, day after dusty day? The trial, a quiet war of words. The Athenian courtroom was not grand. It wasn't a marble chamber lined with pillars or golden benches, as one might imagine. Instead, it was open to the air, filled with wooden seats, plain walls, and the sound of murmuring citizens, 500 of them, chosen by lot, seated as a jury. Socrates, an old man with a bald head, thick beard, and a worn-out robe, stood calmly in front of them. His expression was not defiant, nor was it frightened. It was patient, curious, even. He looked not like a man on trial for his life, but like a teacher preparing to ask a question. He had been accused of 2 things: corrupting the youth of Athens, and not believing in the gods of the city. Now, in Athens, trials were not like they are today. There were no lawyers. The accused spoke for themselves. And so Socrates, in his usual way, stood up not to plead for his life, but to ask questions. He did what he always did. He began with a quiet voice. "Men of Athens," he said, "I do not know if you have been convinced by my accusers, but they are persuasive speakers. I am not. I only speak what I know." He paused and looked around. "And what I know," he continued, "is that I am not wise. But I have found, by questioning others, that they also are not wise, though they think they are." He explained the story of how the oracle of Delphi once said, "No one is wiser than Socrates." Socrates was confused by this, so he went out to question people thought to be wise politicians, poets, craftsmen, and discovered that while they all believed they had great knowledge, most knew very little. In this way, he realized perhaps he was wiser than them only because he knew that he knew nothing. But this, he said, angered them, and so they began to resent me. And now, I stand here, not because I have committed any great crime, but because I questioned those who did not like to be questioned. His voice remained calm. He never shouted. He did not beg. He merely reasoned, slowly and clearly, as though still in the public square, surrounded by students, teaching them to think carefully and speak truthfully. He turned to the second charge, impiety. He said, "They say I do not believe in the gods, but I speak of divine signs. I have never denied the gods of the city. I only encourage people to think about them, and about what justice means. If that is wrong, then I accept my fate." There was no show, no drama, just a man, speaking plainly, defending the life he had lived. The jurors listened. Some were irritated by his tone. Others were bored. Some nodded. Others frowned. When Socrates finished his speech, the jurors voted. The result: guilty. By a small majority. Socrates now faced the penalty phase of the trial. In Athenian trials, Both the prosecution and the defense could suggest a punishment. The jury would choose between them. The accuser proposed death. Socrates was expected to suggest exile, or perhaps a fine, or maybe ask for mercy. Instead, he smiled gently and said, "What do I deserve for a lifetime of service to the city, or questioning people and seeking wisdom? Perhaps I should be rewarded. Maybe I should be given free meals for life at the Prytaneum where Olympic champions dine." There were chuckles, some from amusement, others from annoyance. Socrates continued, offering a modest fine, 30 minas, to be paid with help from his friends. But the jury did not appreciate his tone. They found it arrogant, unrepentant, and so they voted death. The sentence was passed. Socrates, now condemned, stood quietly. He did not shout. He did not plead. He looked calm, almost peaceful. He said, "To fear death is to think you know what comes after, but no one knows. Perhaps death is nothing at all, just a deep sleep without dreams. Or perhaps it is a journey to another place, where I might speak with other wise men and continue my questions." He paused, looked out at the courtroom, and smiled again. "Either way," he said, "I do not fear it." And that was it. The trial was over. There would be no appeal, no last-minute rescue. The sentence was to be carried out in a few weeks, once a sacred religious festival had passed. Socrates returned to prison. He waited, and as he waited, he continued to do what he always had. He talked to those who visited him. He asked them questions. He laughed with them. He taught. Until the day came when he was handed a small cup of hemlock, the path of shadows and soft omens. By the time the villagers began to whisper about the fog that never lifted, the young oracle Callianera had already retreated deeper into the marble halls of the temple. The mists of Delphi, once a morning veil, now clung to the stones day and night. The warm touch of Apollo's sun grew ever weaker, and the air turned cool even in the height of summer. It was not frightening, but it was unendingly gray, and deeply, deeply quiet. It was on such a still and muted day that a delegation of scholars arrived, robes dragging, scrolls in hand, and sandals caked with the dust of long roads. They did not come for prophecy. They came to study it, quiet, methodical, and determined. They paced the outer courtyards and measured the changing patterns of vines on the columns. Their speech was clipped, their movement slow. Each night they ate figs and barley in silence. Their questions were rarely spoken aloud. One elderly man named Tomonos would sit on a three-legged stool by the temple's eastern portico, watching the way shadows fell against the faded mosaic of Apollo slaying the python. "It's the oracle's melancholy," he said once, "a sadness that seeps into the very stone." Callianera didn't hear him, of course. She was in the Hall of Smoke. The Hall of Smoke, so called for the gentle curl of vapors that rose from beneath the earth, was where the priestesses sat to receive their visions. But the smoke no longer brought prophecy. It brought stillness, a kind of timeless quiet that stretched endlessly. When Callianera breathed it in, she no longer saw images. She heard gentle wind, distant harp notes, and the sound of waves lapping against unseen shores. Hours passed unnoticed. She no longer recorded messages from the gods. She simply sat. One evening, as twilight faded into dusk, though it was difficult to tell when daylight ended anymore, the head priest Lycanos approached Callianera with a scroll in hand. His face was lined and pale, as if the very light had fled from his bones. "There is a request," he said in a voice soft enough to float away with the breeze. "From a prince, or a general, or both." "From the southern isles." Callianera nodded slowly, her eyes unfocused. "They want guidance on whether to march against the tribes of the west. They say the stars are unfavorable, but the winds are strong. They offer tribute: olive oil, sheep, bronze." Callianera blinked, as if waking from a gentle nap. "Why would they ask me? I don't hear Apollo anymore." Lycanos smiled, the saddest smile imaginable. "Because even silence is an answer." She nodded again, more slowly this time, and turned back toward the Hall of Smoke. That evening, she sat for longer than usual, not to seek visions, but to listen to the absence of them. The earth below was warm and still breathing, like an old animal at rest. The vapors curled lazily, barely rising. She inhaled deeply. For a moment, just a flicker, she saw something. Not a god, not a war, but a path. A narrow one, winding between olive trees, heavy with fruit. A broken sandal left in the dust. A clay cup, cracked but still holding water, and the whisper of a name. Amarian. The next morning, she told she would leave the temple. The announcement floated through the cloisters like a falling feather. Some of the other priestesses wept softly, not from sadness, but from confusion. A few of the younger ones were already too deep in the grey haze to react at all. The scholars scribbled notes but didn't intervene. The villagers, those who still brought offerings, simply paused at the temple gate, laid down their figs and grapes, and walked away in silence. Kalianera dressed plainly, no gold threads, no laurel crown, just soft sandals and a woolen cloak. She carried no staff and brought no escort. She walked eastward, toward the sea, because that was the way the whisper had gone. The road was quiet. Shepherds watched her from hillsides without waving. The wind moved slowly, like it was thinking. Even the birds seemed reluctant to speak. Kalianera felt neither fear nor excitement, only the odd weight of freedom, a sensation both light and heavy at once. She reached the fishing town of Karina. After 6 days of walking, it was a town with low stone houses, boats carved from pine, and men who spoke with salt on their lips. Amirian was there, not a prince, not a general, just a fisherman with kind eyes and hands, rough from nets and rope. He didn't ask her for prophecy, he offered her bread. "You look like you haven't slept in years," he said, pouring water from a clay pitcher, "and yet you walk like someone who knows where they're going." Kalianera didn't reply. She simply sat and let the silence gather around them like a blanket. Over the weeks that followed, Kalianera stayed by the sea. The smoke was far away now. The grayness in her mind was still there, but it was lighter, like morning mist instead of storm clouds. Amarian didn't treat her like an oracle. He asked her to help mend nets, to carry baskets, to stir the olive paste. Sometimes, she dreamt of the temple, the vines curling, the scholars writing, the priestesses murmuring like doves in a forgotten courtyard. She didn't miss it, but she didn't hate it either. It had simply ended. One morning she awoke before dawn. The sea was still. The sky was purple and soft. She heard the wind whisper through the reeds, and then a sound she hadn't heard in months. A voice, not a loud one, not divine, just hers, speaking to herself. "It is finished." She stood, walked barefoot to the edge of the shore, and let the salt water touch her toes. Back in Delphi, they say the mists began to lift the same day Kalianera stepped into the sea. The temple doors, once covered in dew, began to dry in the morning sun. Birds returned to the porticos. The scholars packed their scrolls and left without fanfare. No new oracle was chosen, not right away. Some say Apollo had taken back the gift, others say it had simply been misplaced. But in time, a new voice would rise from the hall of smoke, not from a cursed child or a reluctant dreamer, but from someone who chose to listen deeply, fully, and without fear. As for Kalianera, she never returned. She was last seen gathering wild thyme by the cliffs, her cloak the color of warm ash, her hair kissed silver by the wind. Some say she speaks to the waves now. Others say she married a Marian and grows olives on a hillside overlooking the sea. All agree on one thing: she brought silence back to the gods so mortals could finally hear themselves again.